Hi, this is Paul. I'm just getting back into the swing of things in terms of commentary videos. I have a long list of stuff from vacation I want to talk about. Whether I'll get it all in, I don't know, because new stuff keeps coming down the road. There's a very interesting conversation with Jordan Peterson and Andrew Klavan that I intend to do a commentary video on, and it's connected with another very interesting video that Rebel Wisdom just presented, which is Jordan Petersonitis with Jonathan Rowson. Rowson, I'm not quite sure how he says his name. Both of these videos are very interesting because we're to the point now that we have some perspective on, at least to some perspective on, the first wave of Jordan Peterson. Again, as time goes, we'll gain more and more perspective. And I thought actually there's quite a bit of connection between these two videos. And so I want to do commentary on both. I'm not going to have time today to get too far into it, so it might be a part one, part two type thing, or maybe there might be 3 parts to it. I don't know. The Jonathan Rowson Rebel Wisdom piece, he did a very interesting conversation with Peterson the same day apparently as Cathy Newman. And after I watched that Rebel Wisdom video, I went back and rewatched this video. And it's pretty easy to see why he got a lot of negative commentary on there. In some ways, the conversation sort of devolved into bickering from both sides. Bickering usually isn't terribly productive, and they did a fair amount of bickering. It doesn't mean that the points that both were making against each other were invalid. And so we'll get into some of those as we look at the Rebel Wisdom video. But just the manner that video went was interesting. And the timing of that video, now that we have by the Rebel Wisdom video, a little bit more perspective on it, is very interesting. And I'll let Jonathan Rowson talk about what he sees as Jordan Petersonitis, which I thought was a very interesting thing. I haven't read any of those pieces by him yet. I still have to dig those up. And, Jordan Peterson at that moment really became sort of a cult leader. And I don't mean that he actually established a cult, but, and some would list me among the elements of that cult, people who've, sort of latched onto Jordan Peterson and haven't let go. And I get a number of complaining comments on my channel about that, but that always sort of mystifies me, because a lot of those who have found my channel because of Jordan Peterson. But of course, there are many others like Cassidy who never really liked Jordan Peterson, but came onto the channel and likes the community and likes the conversation and are here anyway. So that was the RSA video. And yeah, maybe we should just jump into this video because I thought it was really very helpful. Okay, so let's jump in.
On January the 16th, 2018, Jordan Peterson had his famous clash with Cathy Newman, the moment when he broke through to the mainstream and the spark for the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. But it wasn't the only interview he did that day. Shortly afterwards, he went to the Royal Society for the Arts, one of the UK's premier think tanks.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Now, the fact that it was after the Cathy Newman interview is very interesting. We don't know what... Peterson in that period, beginning in January of 2018, he was about to launch his book tour. He was all over the place. Jordan Peterson Jordan Peterson works, okay? Work. That's what the guy does. And so the fact that this interview sort of devolved into bickering, it being on the heels of that very famous Cathy Newman interview, which descended into... didn't really descend into bickering. Peterson just sort of mastered that. This interview didn't go as well.
For a conversation with the philosopher and chess grandmaster, Jonathan Rowson.
My job...
Okay, Rowson. I'll try to remember that.
...was to, challenge him a bit. Find out what he's really trying to say. He can speak beautifully. The audience show up to buy his book and hear him give a great performance. He'd done that hundreds of times before. He'd do it again. But this was a bit different. And I even said to him before we went on, if it's okay, I'll try and challenge. He says, of course. He was keen for all that. As Rule 6 says, make sure your own house is in perfect order before you criticize the world.
Yeah, it's a dark chapter, that one.
Dark, yeah, and challenging and controversial, and I didn't agree with most of it. You know, much of my...
And this will get into that chapter. I think of all of the chapters of 12 Rules for Life, it had my least favorite title because no one can put their house in perfect order. And the whole question, as these two will get into in the conversation, is at what point and how do you engage the broader society? And Peterson doesn't disagree with that. It's just a question of how, but it sort of burrows down into bickering around those lines.
Admire most of the book and the ideas in it. I had challenges here, so I'll try and explain what I think they are. When you say to a whole new generation, take responsibility, they're like, well, yeah, but my fear is that we're going to be inundated with climate change. My fear...
That's a very interesting idea, that somehow a fear legitimates a response, which a fear causes a response and might legitimate a response. But what's interesting about that point is that, okay, tell me in which world human beings have lived that they haven't had legitimate cause to be afraid of something that could justify a response. There's always some fear to respond to.
Fear is that private actors like Google and Facebook now control the public realm. My fear is that artificial intelligence is getting way too intelligent and is actually risking things on the world.
For you. Here's a fear.
Right.
Your attempts to fix that will make it worse.
Well, okay, this is the question, the heart of the matter. So on the one hand, you say, look, you don't have a clue what you're doing, stay out of it, right? But we live in democratic systems.
And I think I already forgot how to say his name, Rowson. He's got a legitimate point here, but so often you can have a conversation with someone, both people are making legitimate points, but it's the tenor, the tone of the conversation that sort of dominates. It's almost, I have this theory about human beings and mood. Angry people will find reasons to be angry. Depressed people will find reasons to be depressed. We so often think that this reason that we have is motivating the emotion, and sometimes it does, but I think it's often the other way around. And if two people get together, I mean, Jordan's wearing exactly what he was wearing on the Cathy Newman interview. That little tidbit is a very interesting little tidbit. And again, this is why I say, within time, there's perspective.
Systems where it's our responsibility not to stay out of it. So how do you manage that? Because you seem to be saying
with humility.
Humility, right? But humility doesn't preclude activism.
Generally, it does. Yes.
Why?
Why?
They're both a little bit categorical here, and I wonder. I mean, Peterson also, knowing what you know, he also seems a little weary. And again, coming out of as a preacher, I know you tend to Sunday morning you rise to the challenge, and even if you're being even if you have a cold or something, I mean, Sunday comes and you're not feeling well, but the adrenaline gets going and you stand and you preach. And then Mondays are famous times not to look for preachers because sometimes they're just a little bit depressed.
That doesn't mean that I'm saying that there is no situations under which political action or activism is justified, because there are clearly situations under which it's justified. But it's not the first thing that you should be taught how to do when you're an 18-year-old person going to university and you don't know a damn thing.
And see, you can already tell just emotionally he's probably tired, a little bit dismissive. His answers are going to be, a little bit punchier. And, this for the other guy, for Jonathan Rowson, this is a big opportunity for him, because especially after 2017, to land time with Jordan Peterson was pretty rough.
So I don't doubt that there's callow youth. I don't doubt that people have a lot to learn. And
they're not learning it from their professors either.
That may be true. So I thought the day had gone really well, right? I went home and I just thought, I wonder what people are saying. And it's on YouTube. And suddenly I was like the outcast. I was completely flogged verbally for all sorts of things, to how I was interrupting him, to what I was wearing, to how I didn't understand.
Just like someone's going to make a comment on this video. It's like, why do you keep interrupting them?
How dare I challenge the professor?
The reaction online was totally polarized between people who hated his lines of questioning and others who were glad to see a real debate. In the aftermath, Jonathan spent months reflecting on the encounter and ended up writing an epic paper all about how he contracted and cured himself of what he called Jordan Petersonitis.
I was very intrigued by the fact that the way the response was mobilized was one of, do you approve of him or not? Now that's the wrong question, right? If you want a mature culture that's learning from intellectual phenomena that are going on, the question is much more, look, why are so many people captivated? What is he saying that might be of interest? If you're not captivated, if you don't get it, what might you be missing, right? That's the kind of question you would ask people to say.
Now I agree, I very, very, very much agree with what he just said. I do want to take a step back, though, and pause and say it's these presuppositional postures that actually make up a culture and are themselves something to think about. So I agree 100% with what he's saying. And
equally, those who are captivated should be curious about those who are not. The lack of curiosity about him amongst my peer group or my professional colleagues, it's like, aren't you a bit curious to know why millions of people seem to think he's so impressive? And they're not, and it bothers me. It's like, that's weird, you know.
We met in the woods of West London to reflect on the experience. So Jonathan,
West London has woods. Cool.
you're a philosopher, you're also a chess grandmaster, and you're head of Perspectiva. But the reason we're having this conversation is that you had an interview with Jordan Peterson beginning of 2018 now. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, kind of recap. Let's start with what's really interesting as well is that this interview was immediately after the Cathy Newman interview, and we've got like a real shared history around, for many different reasons. Our work, your work, and my...
This video is also interesting because, you know, even though David Fuller is producing a lot of content and in many ways sort of behind the camera in a lot of these things, although he's an interviewer too, so he does interview. It's David Fuller's piece of this story is in itself quite interesting. And I've done a fair amount of commentary on interviews with David. Andrea did one, he did another one at a college. And so I really appreciate David's perspectives on these things because he's very much been along for the ride, and I have a lot of respect for how David has approached this ride. David, of course, Rebel Wisdom is connected with, for lack of a better term, men's work, which, well, we'll let David describe who he is for those of you who aren't terribly familiar with David.
My interests cover a lot of the same territory that Jordan Peterson is covering. The role of spirituality, the role of religion in society, the role of the sacred, all of these questions. So we were both hugely affected by it. And you wrote this piece, An Epistemic Thunderstorm, and coined the term Jordan Petersonitis. And it feels appropriate now, 3 years on, for us to have this conversation to just explore what it meant. Yeah. And as you said, the lessons we learned and the lessons we didn't learn. So maybe before we go into that, let's maybe frame this conversation. What are you hoping to get from this conversation?
Oh, a little bit of catharsis, maybe a little bit of, it was 3.5 years, well, it's almost 3.5, so a good period of time. And it was very intense at the time. So looking back now from a sort of safe and comfortable...
It was. Again, perspective is really cool because January 2018 was really an inflection point after Cathy Newman. There were certain, if you think about Jordan Peterson's status rocket ride, I mean, one stage was his first talk with Joe Rogan. Whole group of people, but a fairly specific group of people were introduced to Jordan Peterson then. This Cathy Newman interview just propels him. And of course, this comes out just on the heels of that.
Distance is part of it, so to enjoy the reflection of that. Because we were both heavily involved at the time, to hear a little bit more from you about what you went through and how Jordan Peterson influenced Rebel Wisdom, the different moments of sort of excitement and intrigue combined with maybe distrust or wariness around him, the impact on our social surround and how, what people were saying about him and how that chimed or didn't with what I was experiencing. the writing process of making sense of it and how difficult it was to really get to the bottom of my own feelings about it. But more broadly, since we are 3.5 years down the line, like what did we fail to learn? Like what was going on there that we didn't adequately pay attention to? Now that it's no longer about people.
It's interesting because what did we? Okay, who's we? Is it Jonathan Rowson? Is it David Fuller? Is it me? Who's the we? Who's the us? Is it society, academia? Again, David Brooks labels him the most influential intellectual. Was it influential? But I mean, David Brooks wrote an editorial fairly early on, which was hugely, which praised Peterson pretty significantly, and you'll find that little phrase used as it. Yeah, it's right there on the top, on the cover of Beyond Order, the most influential public intellectual in the Western world today. And it says New York Times. It doesn't say David Brooks New York Times. It just says New York Times. I wonder what the New York Times thinks about whoever the New York Times is, the editorial board.
Peterson as such, what was the Peterson phenomenon about, such that a little bit time downstream we can maybe, pick up something that we lost along the way.
I love your phrase, an epistemic thunderstorm, and I've used the term a one-man lightning rod for the culture war, the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, and it was an extraordinary time, and I think is still, there's so many different layered pieces within it. My piece, The Glitch in the Matrix, which came out in 2018, looked at the Cathy Newman interview from these sort of different layers of like the clash between the mainstream media and the alternative media, and then the kind of gender dynamics that were going on underneath that conversation, all of these different topics. And it was so multi-layered and archetypal even back then. And I remember talking to Richard Tarnas, the archetypal thinker, about Jordan Peterson is certainly carrying some kind of archetypal force.
I see him as, I think some of the force that's coming through him is collective. He is a kind of channel for things that haven't been said for a while, and that, in some sense, needed to be said. He's a kind of channel of the return of the repressed in that sense. And
there's so many different kind of frames. There's like the father energy that he was carrying. There was the sort of the sense of that he was in some ways he was sort of crowdsourced, like he was a genuine internet celebrity that sort of then erupted into the mainstream. The mainstream just wasn't sure what to do with this at all. And there was the sense of him representing this kind of insurgency against this sort of, what I would call a kind of low resolution liberal mainstream worldview, and kind of pulled apart quite a lot on Rebel Wisdom. But the first thing I think would be worth covering, because it's something you covered in your piece as well, is like this tendency that we have to almost immediately split into pro and anti. Yeah. And like this tendency in public culture to do that, and what that means, like how we lose any opportunity to learn from that, because everyone's immediately like, oh, I don't like this, or I do like this. And do you want to start?
And that's a great point. We do it. Why? It's resolution. We encounter something new, and we instinctively, immediately have to categorize it. One of the things I want to get into is Ian McGilchrist's conversation with Jordan Peterson. They're going to talk about McGilchrist a little bit too.
To be honest, that's the heart of the matter, I think, because that was the experience of the time. Peterson appeared as if out of nowhere. I know that you'd seen him coming. I mean, to your credit, you'd noticed what was happening. And maybe what others didn't notice is that he also had this sort of 20-year history of studying mythology and depth psychology, and those two things together made him this sort of sensation. But really, the way people reacted to Peterson was the problem. So I should say early on, like, the issue is not whether you're yay or nay, right? It's not. People are looking for that. People want to know, do you like him or don't you like him? And it's a really...
You never get a second chance at a first impression. It's just human.
Troublesome way of framing things. It's very human. It's a kind of very tribal approach. Do you think he's one of us or is he not one of us? Do you think he's safe or is he unsafe?
Is he a Christian or not a Christian?
That question never really occurred to me for whatever reason. What I saw when he sort of first came to prominence was someone who was very intriguing, quite captivating to listen to, very intense, that he had a certain kind of following, and he was rubbing certain kinds of people up the wrong way. And at that point I was just observing, not really sure what was going on. But I noticed, even from the very early moments, like pre-Cathy Newman interview, before that moment, he was already quite controversial, already written about in lots of prominent papers. And I think I was...
That was after the Joe Rogan. And so, yes, even before Cathy Newman. And again, 12 Rules for Life had about the world's best timing for a publisher. I mean, he was really hot on YouTube. He was starting to hit the circuits. He had been on Joe Rogan, and boom, here's a book ready to go, January 2018.
I was troubled by the fact that people weren't asking, what's he saying? Why is it relevant? Is there something of value here? Those questions weren't really there. What was going on was something about he's doing this for the young men. That was like one quick story that people latched onto. Or he's doing this.
And it's interesting, and I think he's right on this. Okay, so Jordan Peterson, yes or no? And then afterwards, it's Jordan Peterson what? What is this about? Oh, young men. This is about young men. This is about, so people are, and I did the same thing. What is this about? Of course, we're all doing a whole lot of projecting and looking for whatever it is that's salient to us and putting that on Jordan. And part of what was going on with him was he was just talking about so much, we could all sort of find a piece to either agree or disagree with him.
This because he's against the sort of woke left liberal people who are just, flaky and fluffy, and he's back here to get things real and take things seriously. And also he was against the kind of pseudo-activism of people who claim to be saving the world when they can't tidy their room in his language.
Now, I don't think we can also not appreciate how, what was going on in the culture with respect to the American election, Donald Trump. I know these are two guys in the UK. They've got Brexit going on. To give some perspective on what was going on in the mind of the culture, I often go back to this letter from Aaron Sorkin that he wrote his daughter after the election of Donald Trump. Now, remember, Trump was inaugurated in January of 2017. The election was in 2016. That's 1 year. That's 1 year before the events that we're talking about in this video. And the letter says this: while the world changed, this is from November, obviously during the election, while the world changed last night in a way I couldn't protect us from. Oh, that's interesting. That's a terrible feeling for a father. I won't sugarcoat it. And it kind of gets into this thing I talk about often in terms of this deep presupposition about what life is like. Well, life is, there's climate change and there's AI and there are these threats that I'm anxious about. Life shouldn't have any of these things. When has life not had these things? If you have any anxiety, and all of us do to one level or another, you will find something to be anxious about. And once you have that thing that you're anxious about, you have also built into your first draft a picture of how you think life should be. And I mean, you have the whole package that you're working from. So it's hardly the first time my candidate didn't win. In fact, it's the 6th time. But it is the first time that a thoroughly incompetent pig with dangerous ideas, a serious psychiatric disorder, no knowledge of the world and no curiosity to learn it. Wow. That should scare your daughters. One daughter or two? Daughter. All right. It wasn't until Donald Trump won that night. It wasn't just Donald Trump who won that night. It was his supporters too. The Klan won that night. White nationalists, sexists, racists, and buffoons. Angry young white men who think rap music and Cinco de Mayo are a threat to their way of life, or are the reason for their way of life. It's been given cause to celebrate. Men who have no right to call themselves that, and who think that women who aspire to more than just looking hot are shrill, ugly, and otherwise worthy of our scorn rather than our admiration, struck a blow for misogynist shitheads everywhere. Hate was given hope. The world had no time to react. And I gotta fix this a second. Hang on. Roxy, that must be his daughter's name. I know my predictions have let you down in the past, but personally, I don't think this guy can make it a year without committing an impeachable crime. I didn't think he was going to last long either. If he does manage to be a douche nozzle without breaking the law for 4 years, he was eventually impeached twice, he'll make it through those 4 years, and 3 years from now, we'll fight like hell for our candidate, and we'll win, and they'll lose, and this time they'll lose for good. And I think, I just laugh when I read stuff like that. You know, I was having a conversation with Cale Zeldin and Brett Sockold, and they talked about in the Roman Catholic Church when John Paul II became Pope, and then, you know, well, it's the end of history. We've won over our rivals, and we will always win from here on in. Well, that's what one side was thinking. And then along comes Jordan Peterson, and hey, wait a minute, Trump was supposed to be a one-off. And then from then, it's the end of history, and we just keep winning. And anyone who doesn't line up with their narrative, well, now they're on the other side, and it's an existential threat, and politics has become your religion, and off you go.
So I was very intrigued by the fact that the way the response was mobilized was one of, do you approve of him or not? Now that's the wrong question, right? If you want a mature culture that's learning from intellectual phenomena that are going on, the question is much...
That letter does not express a mature culture.
More, look, why are so many people captivated? What is he saying that might be of interest? If you're not captivated, if you don't get it, what might you be missing, right? That's the kind of question you would ask people to say. Equally, those who are captivated should be curious about those who are not. What are they seeing?
Or repulsed is the other
Or repulsed,
side.
yeah, exactly, stronger than that. Those who just think this is a misogynist, old-fashioned, privileged, patriarchal white male who is telling everyone how to behave, we're done with that, get over it, right? That's also there. And this was happening, but I was so disappointed by the kind of lack of let's learn from this approach. And so 3.5 years later, it's a bit easier to do that. But at the time, there was just heat, not so much light.
Yeah, and this conversation could go, like, there's so many different directions it can go in, and there's so many different topics to unpack. So maybe let's start with a kind of chronology. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that I first saw him in 2017. I think Alexander Bard was the first person who mentioned him to me. Right. And
again, I really like this conversation because of a lot of these little details. And who's Alexander Bard? Oh, he's on this other channel that I watch, and someone who's primarily, I've spoken with him, someone who's in France. He's primarily a medium writer.
Then I started listening to his lectures, like genuinely like captivated. I listened to the Maps of Meaning series in particular, and I still think that over and above, certainly far over and above the books that came out since, like there's something compelling about the way that he speaks, that the vision.
You know, the Jordan Peterson, what is that? Why? I mean, that again continues to fascinate me because same thing happened to me. I think the first video I saw of him was the suspender video. And, well, he's engaging the crowd in a very interesting way. He's just not screaming back at them. And then I saw a lecture that he did at Harvard, a piece of a lecture that he did at Harvard it was basically about education and great books. And I listened to that and I thought, yeah, I agree with him. So again, it was the simple yes, no. It's the first question we have. It's the first impression. Okay. First thing I saw was I like how this guy is dealing with his adversaries. Second thing, I like his perspective on great books and education. And then I start listening to the biblical series and Maps of Meaning, and it's like, wow, I've never really heard this before, and I'm finding this to be compelling. And then I start working my networks. Anybody ever hear of this guy? No. Tim Blackman, a friend of mine, says, I tried reading Maps of Meaning. It was inscrutable. I thought, but the lectures, wow, yeah.
And the all-encompassing vision that was laid out, and that was just so compelling, and it tapped into so many things that I was already aware of, like the sort of the deeper mythology, the Jungian perspective, and it was it was like, and I think we were in touch then, and I wrote this piece about Jordan Peterson for Perspectiva, your organisation.
Yeah. Gosh, so we were quite young, looking for new material, new authors. Rebel Wisdom hadn't yet formed, and the title of the piece didn't hold back. It was something like, "Can this man save Western civilization from itself?" or "Why this man can save Western civilization."
It's a pretty audacious title, and I've had other people tell me the same thing. What was it about where we were at? And again, I didn't vote for Trump, and neither of these guys voted for Trump. But yet, I look at one side of the nation having this existential crisis, and the other, and really sort of blindsided. And again, when I saw that, I thought, I didn't think Trump was going to win either. But I didn't think I knew it wasn't going to be a landslide because Hillary Clinton was unpopular. But when he did win, it was like, oh, well, it's not a huge surprise. There's a lot of people that think that way. And then I read Aaron Sorkin's letter and I thought, that's dangerous. You're really going to tell your daughter this, that we're going to win and always win? Well, what are you going to do? Just like Jordan Peterson said on Bill Maher, what are you going to do with the other half of the nation?
And I was like, oh, we'll publish that because it's kind of, intriguing. What on earth could he be saying that, earns him that kind of accolade?
When I first saw his work, I felt immediately this is the message that we need to hear right now. There was something of like, I put all of my chips on Peterson. I was like, this thing is going to go viral. It was sort of this sense of like, this is exactly what we need right now because it fit this hole in the culture.
Yeah.
And that's so interesting. That, and I mean, I had the same thing too, but then I asked myself, okay, fit for what? What am I feeling the need is? And not just what is the telos that we're looking for? What are my hopes? And when I listened to this conversation, I thought a lot about telos and goals, and because telos and goals are always sort of implicit in any sort of narrative construal of our lives.
Perfectly. It was like, it was the deeper story of Western culture. It was taking on the new atheists on their own turf, which is something that we'll come to a little bit more in a minute, because this is...
And see, if I say Christians weren't really taking on the new atheists in a compelling way, of course, everybody has an opinion. But as I described many times, as a local church pastor, there was sort of the road out of the church was a one-way street. And people seldom came back down that same road. And with Peterson, because of Peterson, I saw them coming back down that road. And I knew there's something here I have to pay attention to.
You wrote that amazing piece for the RSA, Spiritualized, I think, where you looked at spirituality and culture, and so you've also kind of been very keen on this perspective. So yeah, I wrote this piece for Perspectiva. That then got me the interview with Jordan Peterson, because I sent him the piece. He really liked it.
Okay, that's good.
He really liked it. I went out to Canada at the end of 2017, got an interview with him that I then turned into the documentary Truth in the Time of Chaos. And then 3 or 4 days after that came out, the Cathy Newman interview happened while I was out in Thailand. And I was in touch with you because you were due to have this conversation with him at the RSA, which happened on...
It's funny because he says while he was in Thailand, because on that Thai trip, he actually met somebody that I know, or actually my wife knows. And so then when they came out here, my wife had said, this person that she knows, this friend of hers, says, it was funny the connections that were made at that time.
On the same day as the Cathy Newman interview. And then I've said this a few times in public, but for me it's still absolutely extraordinary that the main topic of my conversation with Jordan Peterson was Jung. Synchronicities, Jung, and how synchronicities are these amazing coincidences that tell us something about the deeper meaning of reality. And then he shoots to fame on the show, Channel 4 News, that I was working on for about 12 years with Cathy Newman, who I was working in the same newsroom as only a few weeks before. Never worked again in that newsroom after bringing out Truth in the Time of Chaos, which I knew at the time. So I kind of deliberately ended one career by putting that out, thinking that let's see if the roulette wheel comes back on Peterson, and then...
He just said he put all his chips on Peterson, so yep, double down.
Rebel Wisdom pretty much generated an audience by looking at the Jordan Peterson phenomenon and trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
As did my channel. Obviously not as big an audience as theirs, but I mean, to whatever degree my channel got off 0, it was because of Jordan Peterson.
So that's kind of the backstory.
I could say to your credit, David, that not everyone else saw this coming. Like, there was some luck along the way, as there always is, but it wasn't that obvious to everyone that the Peterson phenomenon would become what it was. A lot of people would just have seen another university professor with a little bit of controversy, and that's it. But you had seen something about what was waiting to be spoken about. And he was the person. The people were ready for something like the message, and he was the messenger. But I mean, I should just say before we get too far into this, I have huge reservations about Peterson, and I had them very early on, and just amongst my wife, my friends, my family, people who were just listened to him and were a bit wary. Something about his demeanor.
Now it's interesting here because notice how he mentions wife, friends, family. Why? I always say, we never believe alone. We always believe in groups. Peterson says this often too. We use each other to sort of stay sane. We calibrate our sense making via the community of people that we are spending time with, the community of people that we esteem, the community of people that are around. And so on one hand, independently, he looks at Peterson and is like, oh, but he's listened to everyone around him. They're like, no. And so, stock lowers.
Being a little sharp and a little too intense and hyper masculine, and this sort of language was going around. So I
remember when I brought my wife to the first live event. The first time I brought my wife to one of the live events here, I was really curious. How was she going to? And she liked him. It was very interesting.
I was never at a moment where I thought, absolutely sure, this guy is what we need. And I think maybe early on, it was somewhat different for you.
I would say that we're in a different place now, which is why it feels like the right time to have this conversation. We are in a different place than we were in 2018. Like, he felt like the right key for the right particular lock back then.
At least it could have been, maybe. But I'm not sure it worked out.
But also,
I
think there was a trajectory that we'll come into later that I feel like, and you pointed to in your essay, that in some of his work, you can see him pointing away beyond the culture war dynamic. And then in other ways, you can see that he became a culture warrior and was deepening that dynamic.
Right.
For matters of temperament or for positions that he took or all of this sort of stuff that I think we'll get to in a bit.
But you want to stick to the chronology?
Now again, I want to mention what I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and I'm watching the time slip by, and so I know this will be multi-part. I'm probably going to have to come back to this video again tomorrow and pick it up, which is always dangerous with this kind of thing, but that's just the way it's going to go. But I've got Andrew Klavan's commentary with Peterson in the background, and part of the reason Klavan, contrasting his 3-year retrospective on Peterson in that conversation with Peterson and these two, is because Klavan, he's an author. He wrote a beautiful spiritual biography, which I read a number of years ago and very much enjoyed. He works on a YouTube channel, which is conservative American political punditry. A lot of red meat for conservative American politics. And I've listened to Klavan a number of times, because when people talk about Peterson, they usually send me a little note. When he talks about Peterson, there's often a disappointment and a frustration from Klavan. Why won't Peterson cross the line? I'm writing something for Justin Brierley about Peterson, Murray, and Tom Holland about this. Why won't Peterson cross the line? Why won't he cross the line? And they get into that. And I wanted to do commentary on the Klavan-Peterson talk after this talk because there are connections between them. Now, I've spoken a little bit with David Fuller, and he's spoke a little bit, especially in his interview with Andrea with the Bangs, who's been on my channel a number of times, and she just hosted that conversation with Benjamin Boyce. But, of course, in a lot of ways, David Fuller is post-Christian. And now Jonathan Rowson is, believes in God, but again, not terribly, let's use the word observant. Whether or not he goes to church, I don't know. But what's interesting to me are the parallels between, let's say, this conversation and the take on Peterson, and then what we'll get with Andrew Klavan. So
maybe let's
Well, I just wanted to
let's go to your interview.
I can go to how it came to me, but how it came to me was I think I was told in sort of late December that I'd be doing this on January the 16th or something. So I had time to read his book, which frankly I don't think is that great as a book. I think the prose is kind of prolix, it's difficult to get through. And you often had this feeling in each of the 12 chapters that he was really himself in terms of pointing out lots of problems. And then towards the end of the chapter, he sort of lightened up. But you could very much see the difference in voice in the book. So I felt as though I could really feel the editor's presence in the last part of each chapter.
That's a very interesting observation, and I'm going to have to think a lot more about that.
As the editor was almost saying, give the reader something positive to take away from this. Because as you know, Peterson is, as he said himself, quite a dark, even depressive temperament that he's fought with, and admirably so at times. But the book, you really feel that. So I didn't really enjoy the book, if I'm honest. But nonetheless, I didn't really care because I'd already seen a lot of the videos. And that's where Peterson actually is at his best. And this is the thing that I think lots of people who don't like Peterson or find they're allergic to him in some way never really grasped, I think.
Well, and they wouldn't because, so one of the things, so I've been playing with my Substack, and I've been sort of playing with that in conjunction with how I play with Twitter, partly because obviously this strange phenomenon that I've been playing with on YouTube has happened, but the number of people who listen to a lot of audio content is relatively small. And the way our society structures, a lot of high status people tend to default to reading text because text is quite a bit more efficient than spoken word like this. So it doesn't surprise me that, number one, Peterson's best forum is YouTube, quite frankly. Number two, you get a very different Peterson when you read the books, and he's a better speaker than he is a writer. Number three, those who don't have time to listen to all those videos or who aren't captivated by them aren't going to get him. And so part of his foray into writing is to expand the audience. And, now having been playing around with the spoken word via YouTube and exploring this new medium, it's substantially different than writing. I personally find writing much more challenging because I have to be much more careful. If I misspeak in a video, part of the reason I call all of my videos like these rough drafts is because it's a rough draft. It came off the top of my head. Upon further consideration, I might change my mind. It's a different forum, and so everything around it is different. And again, when I first discovered Peterson, I was rereading Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, which gets into these questions of medium and meaning.
That he's primarily a theatrical spoken performer.
Theatrical is interesting. I always saw him much more as a preacher, because I'm a preacher.
Who just happens to be a seasoned professional, both a professor mostly of social psychology and a clinical.
Just happens to be, well, no, he's been lecturing to students for a very long time, and he often gave tips about, talk to one person at a time. And whenever you'd go to his lecture, you'd watch him doing that. He'd zero in on one person in the audience and he'd keep talking to that person. Now, as a preacher, I don't tend to do that. I think it's a valid technique to use. It's certainly not the only technique.
Clinical psychologist. So he has forms of expertise, and then he has this historic book, Maps of Meaning, written 20 years before, which was barely read, I suspect, because it's so kind of arcane and it's very long and it's not easy to get through. But he turned that into these lectures. And so what people were responding to with Peterson was this kind of intensity. He speaks as if life as such is at stake. And that's pretty new. I mean, there's a line by...
When he said that's new, I'm thinking, well, I don't think you go to church, because that's, especially Protestant church. And in some of my older videos when I talk about Peterson as a Protestant, that's part of it. He speaks like a Protestant preacher.
A line by Richard Rorty, the pragmatist philosopher. He says, the chief instrument of cultural change is not arguing well, but speaking differently.
That's a fascinating statement. The chief let me just play it again.
And I think change. Richard Rorty, the pragmatist philosopher, he says the chief instrument of cultural change is not arguing well, but speaking differently. And I think the thing about Peterson that people maybe didn't grasp until too late was, I'm not sure he actually was saying that much of substance. There is some substance, don't get me wrong.
See, that I disagree with. There's plenty of substance. Now, you might disagree with the substance, but especially when it came to the biblical lectures, and maybe others had said it before in other ways, that may very well be true. You can argue how creative his thinking is. But I learned, at least new to me and new to a lot of people. So the idea that there isn't substance there, I simply don't agree with that.
But primarily it was the tenor and the captivating, intense, reckoning style quality of his speech that people were just mesmerized by. Like, I don't know what he's saying exactly, but I'm intrigued. Because whatever...
Well, that's true. And that function of I don't know what he's saying exactly is something that I've been thinking a lot about the last few months, because we're very strange creatures in that we hear things, and this gets back to the agree-disagree. We hear things and we say, well, I agree with that. And, as a preacher and as a pastor, I get to sometimes, because I have relationships built up with people, I can sometimes push in a little further and say, what exactly did you hear? Most of you don't watch the Freddie and Paul show, which is probably a good thing. But even on the Freddie and Paul show, I'm always interested to hear what Freddie and Nancy hear from me on Sunday. Now, I know what I'm thinking. I have a pretty good idea of what I said. There's a recording of what I said. But what they heard is vitally important. And this relationship, now he's a depth psychologist, obviously, but this relationship between I hear something, I have a low resolution take. One thing that you'll hear sometimes in church circles is in evaluating preachers, people will forget what you say, but they will remember how you made them feel. And I think that is deeply involved with Peterson. Now, to dig down into that dynamic, what and how I said it. Now, certainly there's all of these preacher tricks that I certainly play. I can pause, look deep into your eyes, lower my voice. All of those, that's all technique. That's rhetorical technique. We've known that. And that's a part of spoken language that There are other ways to use written text to get at these things. But we are primarily, again, back to McGilchrist, we are primarily, I'm dyslexic, so the right-left brain always throws me. So right hand, left brain, left hand, right brain. The master lobe of our, and to the degree that you buy how it hooks up physically, et cetera, et cetera. But I think his main point that we are finally, to use Vervaeke's 4 Ps, we are finally far more perspectival than propositional, is all about that I will remember how you made me feel. And the stuff that you said, it goes in there, and I might not consciously process it, and I might not be able to remember it as such, or even be able to tell it back to you. But the words and the examples and the illustrations that you used moved and touched portions of my brain and portions of my, let's call it my spirit, in ways that they moved my mental map. Okay, let's say it that way.
Whatever it is, he seems to really care about it. And maybe I could care about it too. So that was going on. And that's where I was.
And of course, he's a clinical psychologist, which he continued to say. And so he has an understanding of, transference and projection and all of these psychological aspects.
It was like, okay, what is that? Like, what is that intensity? What is he talking about? How can I distill this in a way that makes sense to me and to others? And so come January the 16th, I was going back to my old employer. So I left the RSA maybe a year and a half or so before. And that was interesting in itself. And the other thing that was going on is because I'd created Perspectiva, I was keen to generate our own material too. And I had a thought that an old sort of colleague and friend, Ian McGilchrist, who is familiar to Rebel Wisdom, he might like to speak to Jordan Peterson, and maybe vice versa. And it turned out that Jordan Peterson had heard Ian speak in Toronto or something, and he was very keen to speak. So through his agent, I tried to make this itinerary for he'd arrive at this time, we'd do this interview first, then we'd have a break, then we'd go on stage, then we'd do this other interview. But then, of course, I'm the host. I'm in this unusual position. My job, encouraged by the RSA, but only gently encouraged. They let hosts do what they want, really. Was to challenge him a bit, find out what he's really trying to say. He can speak beautifully. The audience show up to buy his book.
And even that, okay, find out what he's really trying to say. That's a hierarchy right there. Because he's trying to say a lot of things. Find out what he's really trying to say. Okay, that's a hierarchical statement. So what exactly? Distill it down. Put it in a nugget. Put it in a word. But again, this whole business of do I like or not like, that's all mapping. What side of the map are you on? And you start with that. You start with that binary. Yes, no. And then from there, you build nuance. But what are you really trying to say? I'm trying to say this, that meaning is the gyroscope. These are my words of what he's trying to say. Meaning is the gyroscope to navigate within the iron box of secularism when we can no longer see the stars. Do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. That's one of the things he wants to say. But again, they honed in on Rule 6. Why? Probably mattered to him. Because, well, what is behind this activism? There is, I think, a religious assumption that activism will save the world. Well, what's behind that assumption? Well, it's the voice of the people. And when Aaron Sorkin, well, there's good people and bad people. Again, we got another binary. There's good people and bad people. So the bad people, well, they should be moved away, and I correctly use my left hand, and the good people should be brought in, and the good people should be on top, and the bad people below, and on and on and on and on.
You can hear him give a great performance. He'd done that hundreds of times before. He'd do it again. But this was a bit different, and I even said to him before we went on, if it's okay, I'll try and challenge. He says, of course. He was keen for all that. So I began introducing him in a way that said, this morning I think I said something about this morning I made sure that I took the rubbish out and I'd sorted my house out, and I wore a tie especially, and I was sort of trying to sort of say.
I noticed, so I tweeted about this actually. I made when Jordan Peterson talked to Jonathan Peugeot, the thumbnail had Jonathan Peugeot, a picture of Jonathan Peugeot with the shirt that he was wearing in the conversation, which was a plaid shirt, bigger plaid than this, but it was just a plaid shirt. It was fine. Jonathan was in his study, et cetera, et cetera. The thumbnail was remade with Peugeot in at least a coat and a nice shirt. It was an older picture. And I thought, And of course, I remember Peterson, some of those early days, sometimes just in a T-shirt, but then dressing up in a suit. And, you almost get the sense of, makes perfect sense with what Jordan Peterson is doing, wear a suit. And recently in an interview, he talked about, buying this expensive suit and the clothes make the man. I mean, this is all, none of this stuff is incidental. It's all part of it.
I've taken the message on board about self-possession prior to any bigger issue. It comes across as slightly fawning when I look back on it, but it was what it was. And then we got talking, and I was trying to sort of pin him down.
And when he says it comes back on slightly fawning, it's like, are you a little embarrassed for this? Did you put chips on Jordan Peterson then that now you're a little bit regretful of? Oh, we're such subtle creatures.
A little bit to what exactly he was saying. And the conversation went, you've seen it and you know, it got quite heated several times, but it was always quite civil. There was a sort of, I didn't feel during the conversation there was any hostility, but the atmosphere in the audience was charged. And it was only after, then we went backstage and I arranged the interview with Ian, and that's had over 1 million views and was kind of a Perspectiva success, and they got on really well. And
oh yeah, same suit, interesting.
It was a beautiful conversation to watch it unfold. And then his wife had drawn a little, sketch of me, and it was all very amicable. So I thought the day had gone really well, right? And this is where the other side of Peterson comes in, because I went home and I just thought, I wonder what people are saying. And it's on YouTube. And suddenly
when he says the other side of Peterson, I don't think he means Peterson as Peterson. I think he means everything that's around Peterson.
I was like the outcast. I was completely flogged verbally for all sorts of things, to how I was interrupting him, to what I was wearing, to how I didn't understand him, how dare I challenge the professor. And I was like, whoa, what is this? And it got worse and worse, and it went on for days and days. And then there were spin-off videos, and then people started to recognize me in the street, and
I'm starting to wonder if I made one.
Now, most of that was all right, because I felt some kind of productive work had been done, and a lot of people were also complimenting me for the challenge, and so I knew it wasn't a disaster. But you wouldn't know that from reading the YouTube comments. The YouTube comments are very one-sided.
Really? Every time Peter says, well, most of my videos are like 97, 98, 99% positive, it's like, yeah, that's kind of the way. When you find a YouTube video that is really contested with a lot of downvotes, there are reasons for that. Most of the time, YouTube is a social media, and you develop a following, and people like what they like, and they'll keep going back to the channels that they like. And sometimes they'll like to hate a channel. You got a couple of those around, but...
Anyway, that happened, and the next day, to be honest, I had a kind of, I felt somewhat possessed, if I'm honest, like somewhat, like there was an energy that wasn't altogether comfortable, as if something had taken place. And it took a while to work through that. So
that's interesting.
I spent the next sort of 6 months-ish, obviously with other responsibilities, but just trying to write down what was that about. Not just the feeling, but the whole phenomenon, and what I had to say, what it meant for Perspectiva. So I did that, and that was the publication, yeah. So.
And you coined Jordan Petersonitis.
Petersonitis, right. So that term,
Now I've got to drop this in about 5 minutes, and I'm not going to get a chance to pick this up until later. See what I do with it, I don't know. But I'm going to have to dig up that publication and read it now.
Petersonitis, that's what I had prior to interviewing him, and to some extent afterwards. And it's to do with the cultural pressure to take a side, but not really being able to, despite a lot of effort, right? So I define it more clearly, and there's lots of symptoms in the paper, but the essence of it is the cultural pressure to say yay or nay to a public figure. The
cultural pressure to say yay or nay to a public figure. Yeah. Not just a public figure. Oh, the current ones, of course, are the biggies. Systemic racism, white supremacy, take a side, you'd better be on our side. Well, of course, religion is all about this. Politics is all about this. Every time, I mean, in the United States, every 4 years, we have this presidential campaign. I think people join political parties just so they can just stop thinking about it sometimes.
Being able to, because on the one hand he says things and he says things in a certain way that you like, and you think we need more of that. On the other hand, he'll say something somewhat ridiculous or maybe a bit banal sometimes also, and you think, well, I'm not so sure about him. And so the problem is that that's normal. That's like human being behavior. People are not perfect, and they'll say contradictory things, and they will know some areas well and others not so well. But somehow he got caught up in this big sort of torrent of Peterson phenomenon that it was as if he was meant to have a whole world view sorted out already, and he didn't.
It's a messiah complex. You have this in churches with preachers that, and as a preacher, you learn to be careful with it. I remember one family that I still know quite well, who the first time they were in church, she sat up front and she cried, and after the service, she was, "Pastor, I don't know why your church is so small. That sermon was amazing. This church is going to explode. You're amazing." And it's like, as a pastor, you've been around the block. It's like, be careful with this one. Once they put you up on a pedestal, more often than not, they'll kick that pedestal out from under you. And when you fall, oh boy.
What he had was a certain forms of expertise and a certain rhetorical capacity, and then he was expected to know everything about everything, and he just didn't.
Yeah.
So I think I'll pause it there. And let's see, we're almost about a third of the way through. There's a lot more where he gets into individualism that I'm going to want to pick up on because, again, I see this as sort of a nice parallel to the Andrew Klavan conversation, because Christians have had their own sort of relationship with Peterson, and a lot of these dynamics of having to have all the answers, being a hero, very much come into that. And that other issue of heroism and the hero very much is a piece of that. But I have to stop this right now, so we'll see where this goes. Well, this is day 2 in this commentary, and those of you who follow me on Twitter have an idea about what I've been busy with. I wrote a Substack about half of it, and then I just had a whole bunch of other tweets. I used to process this stuff quite a bit more on Facebook, but Facebook is a different audience, and so I've decided to play around with it a little bit on Twitter. All of that is to say that none of this is completely theoretical for me. This is a hard world. By the grace of God and with the sweat, hard work, and determination of generations past, it's a lot better world in many ways than it has been in the past for a great many people. But those who are homeless with substance abuse issues, it's a difficult and knotty problem. So, yeah, it probably seems sort of random in the middle of this video because I recorded an hour of it yesterday and then had a little bit of work to do in this area and had a lot of work to do in that area today. So, again, those of you who follow me on Twitter can read about it if you're curious about it. It's half of that story is in a Substack called "I'm an Asset, Not a Liability." So hopefully I'll get a few days reprieve. And then maybe basically what happens is when I go away on vacation, people in the neighborhood realize that if I'm gone from the church for a certain number of days in the row, they start camping here. And when I get back, I have to deal with usually moving them out. And I try to do so gently, and I try to do so in a Christian way. But there, with at least one individual, there's a history of violence, and there's a restraining order, which he doesn't like to obey, and which usually getting the police to enforce it is a little bit of work, and it takes some time and commitment, and isn't always in the best interest of that individual, so that's a last resort. And so basically today I was able to get him into the hospital. That's another way to move him off the property. And I'm in contact with his probation officer, and when he comes out, I'll work through those issues again with him and hopefully bring some resolution. But let's get back to the video.
That's a conclusion that I've come to since, is that I think he got seduced by that sort of certainty, by that kind of feeling of certainty, and I think there was this sort of trajectory where that was what was expected of him, and I think he played into that, and I think that became very, very dangerous in retrospect.
Of course, he's talking about Jordan Peterson here. For those of you, after I edit this video, it'll be one continuous thing, and the words that I just said will seem like an interruption. They don't seem like an interruption to me because I've been living this other timeline through it. But I think, I've over the last 3 years, even though David Fuller is a content creator and his focus is on facilitation, I very much appreciated his perspectives on Jordan Peterson, and I think he does so in goodwill. And I think on this he's right, and that isn't to really say anything against Peterson, given what he faced in starting with Bill C-16 and going all the way through the illness of his wife and then his own illness, and then once he gets back with that interview from the Times of London. I mean, good grief, man. I know a lot of people who they get 1 or 2 negative comments on Twitter or YouTube or Facebook, and, they're under the cover sucking their thumb for a day or two. Poor Jordan Peterson had the weight of a lot at him, and what you tend to do when those things close in is you respond to them. And the fact that in some ways Peterson doubled down on a lot of culture war issues rather than sticking sort of to the side of the conversation that David Fuller and myself and Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke would rather see him stay with. Well, that's on Jordan. That's his decision, but there are consequences to it. So I think what David said here is basically right.
Another thing I was going to say is, we both come from an environment, because I think it'd be very easy to look at sort of Rebel Wisdom's content. I mean, we've been relatively, we've interrogated the Peterson phenomenon. We've had people on who've been critical of Peterson, probably not as much as some would want. But we've put out pieces like the Peterson Paradox. I put out a piece saying it doesn't matter if you're right if no one is listening. And also, although we've kind of had a lot of success in terms of building an audience, there's also costs involved in saying that this guy's got something worth paying attention to, which I think you were aware of as well when you did this, and I've been very aware of as well. It's not one-sided. And
it's to speak about founder syndrome. It's not as though Peterson is a founder of Rebel Wisdom at all, but there is a sense in which it's hard to escape that, right? The energy was there. It gave you a big sort of trajectory and volume of material. You caught the wave and rode it, but then you're sort of left with that audience, and for good and bad. So no, I can see the challenge. One thing I was going to say that's quite important, I think.
And what he just said there is right. And to a smaller degree, that's true of my channel. My channel certainly caught the Jordan Peterson wave, or the wave caught us in some ways. In some ways, the wave caught Jordan too. And I've continued. I just did a conversation this morning with Benjamin Boyce, and he asked me about, plans for the channel, and I basically said, I don't plan my channel. The conversations come to me. The content that I produce, or at least the monologuing I do, usually has everything to do with whatever I'm processing while I'm doing. I do much more planning at church and in that work, and so there's more planning that goes on in the sermons and those kinds of things, not all of which is seen in my channel. But there is a larger arc that I am working, but the smaller stuff. And so when Jordan Peterson took his hiatus for health reasons, I continued to work on other things, because my channel has been basically about thinking, and Rebel Wisdom has continued to work on the kinds of things that they've worked on.
The truth, right? One thing I was going to say that's quite important, I think. The truth, right? There's this lovely saying in courtroom dramas, I don't think they say it in the UK, but in the US, promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, right? So I think one way to
They don't say that in the UK. It's got to be a mess.
understand Peterson is he's really into the truth, right? And he might even be into nothing but the truth. But he doesn't do the whole truth very well, right? I think that's one way to kind of critique him without sort of rejecting him entirely.
This is the core. I think
Right.
just doubling down on this, I think, is the core, because as you'll know, we've talked before, like my take on Peterson now is that he's necessary but not sufficient. Like I think everything that he is saying is, or an awful lot of what he is saying is absolutely necessary. The individual is necessary, but there is something more. And I think that insufficiency is what we will hopefully talk to here, and also bring in the developmental lens,
Right.
which, so Perspectiva is really based around developmental thinking. So Piaget, Ken Wilber is another famous example, Robert Keegan, which is also very influential over Rebel Wisdom. And that developmental lens, I think, is something that was needed and missing
At the
from
time.
the conversation around Jordan Peterson, and also the conversation around the intellectual dark web, which kind of arose in the aftermath. Like at what...
Oh, okay, so on one hand, and they're going to get into individualism here, and I think, so when I hear them talking about the developmental lens, they are thinking, and actually Benjamin Boyce and I were talking about this a little bit today. I mean, Benjamin frames, and I think this is deeply cultural at this moment. The framing is around individual development. And they're going to critique individualism in this, but I think what Christianity and particularly the church has to offer is, in fact, the sort of the other side to Peterson's individualism. And again, part of the reason I started working on this stuff was because I saw immediately that an individual can go into an auditorium and, can make YouTube channels, and many people can be changed by that message. And I think the phenomenon continues to be important to study and to participate in because of that change that are happening in people's lives. And I think, again, even though Jordan does talk about systems, especially the university system and other systems, the core of his mission is individual transformation, okay? And he's a clinical psychologist. The core of clinical psychology is individual transformation, the patient-client relationship. And that's a great core. It's a great goal. But as where my conversation with Benjamin Boyce went, I was talking about the agent arena relationship, in that a person is transformed not merely from the inside out, but also from the outside in. And this is where I think some of Jonathan Haidt's work is important when it comes to his metaphor of the elephant and the rider. The elephant doesn't fundamentally change by the rider talking to the elephant. The elephant isn't that type of thing. And when you, let's say, will map Ian McGilchrist onto Jonathan Haidt, the elephant is the master and the rider is the emissary. Now, how do you change the elephant? You change the elephant by changing the herd, and you change the herd via the elephants, and you change all of them with the path. And so in many ways, what religion has always done, especially within narrative, is to construct these far larger narratives which shape the elephants and the communities. And they do so in a mythological way, because mythology is not only basic in terms of a culture, but it is accessible. It's highly accessible for the people in ways that, all of this theoretical talking that we tend to do on my channel that Rebel Wisdom majors in. Now, I know that they do all kinds of other work too in terms of practices. And of course, John Vervaeke has been working on this, and some of those in the John Vervaeke side of this little corner of the internet that we've been working in. Fair enough. But the church has been majoring in these things for a very long time, as have other religious traditions, absolutely. The church has been majoring these things in a long time, and I think, again, that's part of the reason when I saw Peterson's work, on one hand, I wanted to learn it because I wanted to just up my game and improve my skills and figure out, okay, why is he having the impact in our culture and in individuals' lives the way he is? But I immediately thought of what happens after the crusade. And again, if you watch my earlier videos, you notice that I regularly compare Peterson to someone like Billy Graham. The crusade comes to town, the music swells, people go down to the front, they experience a transformation. And then anybody who's worked in that sphere knows that's just the beginning of the work. All of the hard work comes in community. And, you know, one of the things that I appreciate, and a little later in the week, I'm going to meet with David Fuller's outfit again in a thing. And when I look at multiple efforts now at attempting to create a degree of community online, which I have done and participated in, you have to think about longevity. And in some ways, any community that is based on a technology. So an online community that I've been participating in 20 years, it's a listserv. I mean, so that's an older form of internet community. And that listserv's been going on maybe 40 years, okay, from the very beginnings of email. It has to do with my denomination and my church. Churches go on for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. Now, we don't really know the way technology is going to impact these things, but it's that kind of longevity. Well, maybe I should pull up the tweet that I did. Okay, so here's my Substack, and this is the asset, not a liability. The rest is history. Did another excellent podcast on California, and I was amazed how well these two Brits sort of captured California. I was sitting listening to it in my backyard, thinking about the glorious California life, but I knew, on the other hand, when I went to church, exactly what would be facing me, which was a good amount of homeless work I had to do, and wrote about that in my Substack. And then I come in and, actually he was in the hospital then. And I talked about how the city had like these intervention teams that were going to go to homeless people and connect them up with services. And an important member of my local community here, not of the church, but of the other non-government organizations in the community, very wonderful guy. He's president of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and he said, I'm going to send a navigator over, and he's going to help with him. I said, great, give it a shot. If he can make more progress than me, I'll celebrate. I'll buy him a drink, whatever. And the guy comes and I said, yeah, you'll find him. He's right over there. This is before the assault and the restraining order and all those kinds of things. But I said, yeah, you'll find him there. And so then the guy calls me back and says, I couldn't even talk to him. That guy's nuts. And it's like, yeah, what do you expect? I don't know what kind of people you work with on your job, but this guy's actually in many ways easier to manage than some that I've known. And then I talked about the fact that I remember when I came to this church, people were a little nervous because of all the group homes and all the homeless, and how would Paul handle that? And they were quite surprised. I just assumed this was part of the job because I had grown up, and for 36 years my father did this work. And truth be told, before he did this work, my grandfather He took a call to Owen Sound, Ontario, and that was after the Second World War. And when anyone speaking Dutch would show up at the train station, the railroad would call my grandfather. And, I got these stories. My father at that point was already in college in Michigan, but my uncle and my aunt were children living at home. And, Grandpa would slide in with my uncle, and Grandma would slide in with my aunt when they were children to give the big bed and the good bedroom to whoever came to the train station. And my grandmother used to tell me stories of during the Depression when they had some churches in the American Midwest in Wisconsin and Minnesota, that there were marks on the telephone poles from the railroad. And once my grandmother noticed, all the marks just mark on each telephone pole, and then in front of their house was a cross. And that meant that anybody riding the rails could, follow the marks, and then at the cross, go and ask those people for food. And, my father has memories of being a boy, and there'd be a knock at the door, and there'd be a man. And so and this was during the Depression. Those churches were poor, and they often didn't have money to pay my grandparents. And so they would pay them in butter. And in fact, at one point, my grandmother wrote an article for the Banner, the CRC publication, like 13 cents or, 5 cents and 13 pounds of butter. They weren't being paid in cash. Every now and then they'd butcher a hog. And my grandfather and grandmother were lifelong gardeners because, they kept body and soul together during the Depression by growing their own food. And by, getting maybe a bit of a cow or a bit of a hog or something from the people in the church. And yet, when someone riding the rails knocked at their door, they fed them. This is the kind of long-standing community that the world needs. And for all of the problems and liabilities of the church, what are you going to replace it with? These government organizations, as I talked about when I was doing a little bit of church history in the book Reformations, a lot of this got going. It happened in the Catholic spaces via monasteries and churches. It happened in Protestant spaces. The cities kind of picked it up in the Swiss Reformation. But this is what we do. People need communities to make sense, but not just to make sense, but to find community. So this morning, and I got to church, and there was a car. During COVID, I was in the habit of setting up computers because not all of our seniors can run a computer or have internet. So I'd set up computers in different rooms so that they could do their small group Bible study on Zoom. And now most of them are vaccinated, so we're getting together, and that's a good thing. But I noticed the car of one of my seniors who's struggling with memory issues right now, and I don't know how much longer she'll be able to drive. And I was a little worried because the car was empty and she wasn't there. And then another car of another one of our members, one of our deacons, pulled up, and both of them got out. And Pastor, we decided, and it was the birthday of the first one that got here. She's 85. Pastor, it's her birthday today. And so we went and they got breakfast sandwiches at Burger King. And Pastor, we brought one for you. So the three of us sat down and ate Burger King breakfast sandwiches. And that's the life of the church. Celebrating a birthday. Helping each other with very practical things. Listening to each other when we maybe have memory issues and we start to repeat ourselves and we have to buy the Bible study book 3 times because we didn't remember we bought it at all, and then we misplaced it and we can't find it, and what time does church start and what day of the week is it, and this is what we need each other for. And so much of this, we don't have enough money to pay people to be people's friends. We need friendships, and we need networks of relationships, and they need to be local. And, for all the experimenting that we're doing online, and it's both and, it's not either or. Don't get me wrong. This is the kind of thing we need to be doing.
At points, was it a reactionary force pushing against the excesses of what Wilbur would call green postmodern culture, and where did it reach the point of a resolution of the implicit tensions between postmodernism and modernism? And that's an absolutely core map that I think if you don't have, you're pretty much stuck in a reactive frame. And that would be my critique of Jordan Peterson, is that at times, and especially at the beginning, when I interviewed him in 2017, he was a much more warm, welcoming, avuncular kind of person, and then he became more and more kind of pinched and more reactive as time went on.
And to be
I
fair
know
to
people
him,
who were close to him saw this happen, and I mean, in a way, it's like, let's not be judgmental around that. The amount of attention, the amount of bad faith attacks, the amount of criticism that was just unfair, was intense. But another thing that you said to kind of frame that is that often the argument isn't the argument. The argument that I think a lot of the reaction to him was unfair. It was incorrect. It was pointing at the wrong things. But I think in some ways there were things that were not fully expressed, like the bad faith criticism obscured the good faith criticism.
Right. So yeah, there was this kind of miasma of partial truth, and what I mean by that is on both sides, and by both, there are many sides, but for the sake of argument, those who were broadly in favor of Peterson, who felt he was a necessary and good thing, and those who felt, what is all the fuss about, he's not even intellectually that coherent, and he's also very reactionary, and they were both partly right, but the problem is that
this knock on Peterson of not being coherent, he's not perfect, but sure, there's always, again, okay, the world is too big. Back to the world is too big. There's always selection, relevance, realization. I don't know. I don't hear Peterson. You might fault him for maybe emphasis on this and that. You might fault him on saying this and not that. You might fault him on, accentuating this and underplaying that, but I never heard him as incoherent.
They held on to their partial truth without being interested in the other side of the story. So when I say he struggles with the whole truth, what I mean by that came up actually, I can explain this developmentally maybe, because in that interview prior to going on stage, which is available online, I did try to get to him to say, look, self-authorship is not the end of the story. He actually has a company called, or it's maybe he did, I'm not sure if he still does, about self-authorship, a kind of consultancy arm training people to be self-authored. And by that he means, don't simulate thinking based on what's in the social surround. Don't just pick up sound bites and narratives and stories and pass it off as thought. Figure out for yourself what's really going on and build your identity around that. And there's a case for that. But developmentally, there's a long way to go. There's a lot of other ways of looking at things. And when it comes to the truth, you can get to the truth with your own kind of ideological frame, your own epistemic frame. And I think Peterson did that. But his frame is quite, it's grounded in the individual. It's fundamentally a psychological frame. It's quite Manichaean in spirit. It's sort of binaries, a world of polarities, not kind of dualities that sort of interpenetrate, but something more like either this or that.
See, and I hear that critique of Peterson too, but I've heard a lot of his stuff. And especially before he was sort of backed into a corner and forced into these fights. When you listen to Maps of Meaning in his college lectures, he'd always both and things. And so, I don't know that that's, maybe it's a fair criticism of Peterson after 2018, because, in 2018, after the interview with, after the interview that they're talking about here, it got a lot worse. But before then, I'd listen to him, and he'd both and both sides these things quite a bit. So I disagree with that critique.
Man or woman, masculine or feminine, good or bad, this kind of thing. And from that perspective, he could see a lot, and he can explain a lot, and he can tell beautiful stories and captivate people for hours. But what he didn't do very often is critique his own model of the world. He didn't very often come back and say, See, and again, I think he did that a lot more before 2018. And basically after 2018, especially
once his wife got sick, once he's in the middle of the feeding frenzy, and then once he's struggling with his own health issues. Well, if you've ever been in pain, if you've ever been scared, you know, then things tend to get very binary, and it's me or you, and so it's going to be you. So
this thing about order and chaos, I wonder where that came from exactly. You know, what kind of mental model was I using to make that binary? And or does he say something like, you know, I wonder what an anthropologist would say about this? Or if a sociologist would hear, how would they critique what I just said?
One of the things that John Vervaeke had said a number of times publicly, and so I'm not, divulging anything here, and I think Vervaeke's critique of Peterson was true on that. He would mention Panksepp and Piaget and Jung and Nietzsche, but in comparison, let's say, to Vervaeke, who sometimes goes over the other way, I agree. This point that Rowson is making, I agree more with.
You never hear him say that kind of thing. He's not that interested in sort of epistemic plurality. He was quite interested in building a model of the world based on the axioms he had, which were powerful axioms. But it's like one of these sort of cartoon stories where there's a certain power, but it's also limited. And so when it comes to the whole truth, what I mean is, very often he'll say something like, he'll give a generic praise of capitalism. Capitalism's made us all so prosperous, and life expectancy is getting better. Blah, blah.
And again, when I heard this critique, I thought, well, but again, in the earlier days, he would talk about, hey, what capitalism is good for, and then he would turn around and say, yeah, and it's also bad for these. You've got the Pareto principle, and so.
You'll say, yeah, but it's also deeply problematic. So much unemployment, people are dying young, it's getting worse, ecological impact. And I think, to his credit, in a less heated environment, as a thoughtful, intelligent person, he can follow all of that. There's no intellectual limit in that sense. But there is a kind of ideological, cultural limit in that he's forced to play this position of having this view of the world, and then doubling down on any attack on it is, by definition, a threat, rather than something that he might learn from. That was what I began to notice. So the emphasis on truth that he makes, the whole truth is actually a bit of a threat to truth as a kind of lodestar or touchstone, because what the whole truth does is it says, yes, you're right to look for the truth, but don't expect it to be sort of absolute and final. It will be a process of revision. It will have multiple perspectives. It will be contested. And it's difficult to build a movement around that, So when he's speaking to his mainstream audience, and by that I mean the people who most identify with him as a kind of father figure who can tell them how to live, tentative truth's not going to cut it, right? He wants something firmer, rules for life. And that's...
This point he's making here, I think, is a valid point. But one of the things that I've noticed so again, I've just told some stories. I've worked a lot of my life in areas where there are different kinds of churches. For a pastor like me, who tends to, in some ways, be part of people who read books, Jonathan Rowson, this level of society, the frame that he just gave is sort of the dominant frame. But when I work with Pentecostal pastors who are going and hauling, helping young men get out of jail, it's bright lines, rigid rules, strong boxes to help some of these individuals get off drugs, get out of the gang, get off the streets, save your money. That culture tends to dominate in spaces like jails, streets, gangs, people who are struggling with all sorts of things, and they need bright, clear lines to help them. And I've had the experience that there was one individual who, it's often the case, started coming to church. He was in the neighborhood, history of gang involvement, violence, a lot of stuff in his life. And all the nuance that I tend to bring to my ministry, to my preaching. I mean, often the kinds of people who will gravitate and settle in my churches are people who are culturally closer to me. They're into nuance, they're into both sides, they're into understanding, being skeptical, all of this stuff. That particular game, that tends to be a posture which a rather stable middle-class life can afford. But if you're 22 years old, you've spent a few years in prison already because you got caught up in gangs, you were selling drugs, you were using drugs, you might have a kid or two out there. Usually the kinds of pastors, and so I baptized this guy and his children, and they became members of this church, but I couldn't help him. He eventually would wander over to more Pentecostal churches with sharp lines and right and wrong, and that helped him a lot more. Now, there are downsides to some of that, which I, of course, could see, but he needed to stay faithful to his wife, not slip back into old ways of getting his way via violence and physical intimidation. He needed bright lines and strong rules in order to help him stay on the straight and narrow. And he wasn't getting those from me. And so, this critique of Peterson, it's fair, but in some ways, Peterson was much more working. See, Peterson could, in some ways, sort of do both. But many of the people that gravitated towards Peterson and his message needed to clean their room. They needed someone who's going to learn to draw a firm line. And that's what they needed. And that's what he messaged. And sort of this affluent, middle class, you can sort of afford to be a functional alcoholic group. I want more nuance. Yeah, fair enough. But for many of the people he was reaching, they needed those bright lines. And that's just a dynamic that I've seen over years in ministry.
Where some people lose a bit of interest because they can see that those rules are not really rules. They're kind of guidelines based on one particular view of the world. So.
And to a certain degree, a degree of order already present in your environment affords things like guidelines, whereas if you've got a lot of chaos, you really need some rules.
Yeah, I mean, I have framed Peterson in the past as the last gasp of the heroic individual. Like, I think he kind of articulated that.
Oh, he won't be the last gasp. This isn't going away.
And I think it is true. Like that story of the individual, the kind of the sacred individual that's contained within the Judean-Christian story is absolutely true. And it's it's a very big story. Yeah. And I also would say that what was compelling about him was this focus on truth and this focus on the Logos as articulated truth. And I think the other compelling thing about him was that he was congruent with that message. There was the sense of spoken truth articulated through what he was saying in a really organic way. And it's interesting, like personally, my attention span has just completely gone with like, the number of notifications we get, kind of the hijacking of social media. The other day, one of his Maps of Meaning lectures came on after another YouTube film I was watching. And I'd seen it before, but I still had to turn it off to go to bed after about an hour. Right. Like I was still compelled because there was something about the way he was talking in those Maps of Meaning lectures that is kind of like he knows the territory, but he's following a thread of inquiry. Yeah.
One of the really amazing things about Peterson was that he has such range in that he can do the college thing, he can do the nuance thing, he can do the both and thing, but he can also get down to hard lines and bright lines and rules instead of guidelines. And again, part of that is built into his story. He tells that well, working in, grew up in Alberta, of course, so there's the oil industry. Some of these some of these grimy places of Hard Knocks. And then also, again, if you read 12 Rules for Life, his daughter. I mean, so he instilled this into his daughter because she needed it, because it would have been easy in our present context to, well, you know, Michaela, she's sick. We got to really cater to her. At the end of my conversation with Benjamin Boyce, we talked about some of this, because it's very difficult to know. We talked about reciprocal narrowing and reciprocal broadening. And I mentioned that, you know, you don't become an impressive physical specimen by being a couch potato. There's an agent-arena relationship. If the arena is the sofa and a big screen TV and Netflix, the agent's going to get flabby. You become an impressive physical specimen in a context of either intentional artificial adversity, which is, let's say, a weight room or a gym, or a physical context, let's say the army or a blue-collar laborer who's working with their body all the time. And so part of what they did for Michaela, which shone through in 12 Rules for Life, was, you know, the bright lines, the rules. Michaela, you're not going to feel sorry for yourself. You are going to fight this. You are not going to be the kind of person that uses this medical situation as an excuse which will destroy your life. And you see this in Peterson and how he addressed his own medical problems. Now, someone in the comments or someone messaged me and talked about their disappointment. And you know, some of that critique I think is fair. You know, hey, you're a clinical psychologist. Couldn't you have understood the benzodiazepine threat? I mean, yeah, okay, you're not a psychiatrist, you're not a physician, but you do have the internet, and certainly the internet has fueled a world of internet doctors. And I think it's that sense that should keep people from, you know, a messianism about him. Yet, going back again to the analogy of the kinds of pastors, usually pastors who themselves spent time in prison, and you find them in the black community, you find them in the Hispanic community, pastors who were able in the midst of prison, through very hard rules for life, amounted to something, whereas the vast majority of everyone else didn't. And so they know those rules, and so they instill them. And now again, that kind of pastor probably wouldn't have helped me as a teen, partly because because of the parenting that I had. I think my mother had rules too, Frisian mom. But I had so many of those rules internalized that I could afford guidelines instead of rules. And I've known pastors who could work the grime line. If you don't know what I mean by grime line, I did a video I'm sure it's the only video on YouTube that you'll find hits Paul Vanderklay grime line. It'll come up. That was, you know, talking about Matthew McConaughey and some of that conversation. And Peterson is there with that. It's not unusual to find those pastors from the School of Hard Knocks who have rules that can't keep the rules themselves, or at least can't keep them 100%, even if they're demanding 100% from those that they are discipling. Why? Because we're human beings, and we all have feet of clay. So, yeah, the danger of working the grime lines with hard lines is it's very difficult for us to keep it. And some of us, you know, those can also make you rigid, which can also make you weak in a particular way, especially when the arena or the context changes. So, again, that's a part of Peterson that sort of we in the talking heads part of the internet, who for the most part have college education and internalized order systems because we had reasonable parenting and, and hard line is no alcohol. A guideline is not too much. Now, maybe you're one of the people that can live with the guideline and it's perfectly okay. But I know a lot of people who keep the hard line because of how they were brought up and what happened in their life and what they've done when they've broken those rules. So, yeah, this is a part of Peterson that sort of, for those of us who are college educated, like to talk about ideas, yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. That's the side of him that's not necessarily for us. But don't deprecate the importance of that side, because there are probably, depending on the culture, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 people out there that need a rule because they can't really afford a mere guideline.
Of kind of genuine, curious inquiry into, and there's an aliveness that I think he started to lose more and more and more as he became, as the story became well known, especially when he sort of went around the world telling essentially very similar stories night in, night out. And that sense of novelty, which is something we've talked about a lot on Rebel Wisdom as well, is like there was this sense of novelty in a lot of the conversations that he was having, and maybe a lot of the conversations in this kind of intellectual dark web space were having in 2018, that then, like, I don't know where the novelty is now. And I think we're sort of wanting to find, okay, where is the novelty? Maybe it's in the people who, maybe it's in the Schmachtenbergers.
And I think, I think David's right here, but there's always novelty. Again, I'm one who can afford guidelines. Novelty is something that, give it its due, but one of the ways we distract ourselves to death is by always following novelty. And so, again, a lot of this stuff is about balance. And you learn this in church work because you need enough novelty. You need some new things, but you need some old things. You need the ritual and the novelty. And actually, the novelty is seen when there's a context of ritual. So,
of this world, maybe it's in the kind of some of the other people who are now bubbling under after this kind of epistemic thunderstorm has passed.
Yeah.
That's a great phrase, epistemic thunderstorm.
Well, I mean, a few things came to mind there. One was a lovely line by Carl Rogers, the psychotherapist. He said, "What is most personal is most universal." And I think that's the key to understanding Peterson's appeal, is he's deeply personal. He'll speak about his own troubles and travails and how much anguish he goes through, his own.
Again, this is part of the preacher in Peterson. And I remember going to a Rick Warren conference early on, because I came back from the Dominican Republic and then had to sort of get up to speed on what was happening in terms of missiology in North America. So I went to Willow Creek Conference and I went to a Rick Warren conference, and Rick Warren said, "The personal is the powerful," as a preacher. And he was exactly right when he said it. It was like, yeah, and I've seen that confirmed again and again. The personal is the powerful. And so the personal is universal. Yeah, that's true too.
Depressive thoughts, his darkness, he really intensely feels these things, and people can identify with them.
And a perfect YouTube star. Like the paradox of being like not a digital native, but YouTube and internet is all about letting people into your life, letting people see your family, letting people see your struggles. Right. Like he was transparent in that way.
Yeah.
And again, that's just standard preacher stuff. And there's always a cost, the preacher's kid, the preacher's family, the expectations, all of that. But that's, it works on YouTube because it works in people, because that's how people build community. They want to know you to one degree or another, sort of 360 degrees.
And yet he had this sort of backup of having taught at Harvard and being a tenured professor and clinical psychologist and having written books. So people gave him a lot of benefit of the doubt. And as time went on and he spoke more and more about things he didn't know so well and less about things he did, he became a different kind of person, I suppose. But in terms of where things are now, I mean, that kind of, the most interesting moment for me is the interview I had with him that I also talk about in the paper, is I was saying to him, look, you seem to be saying there's something sacred about the individual. And he responded very pointedly, and he said, it's not that there's something sacred about it. That's it. That is the sacred thing. And that is, as you say, Judeo-Christian mythology or mythos even that say.
And I went back and as I said before, I watched the video and he did say that. But also in the video, he has a way of saying that is the thing, but then there are other things too. And it's like, you're playing around with the hierarchy here.
Is the heart of life is something about the sanctity of the individual, that somehow we're a reflection of, the divine in some way, and that this is it. To know yourself as an individual in God's image is somehow it, right? That's the answer.
But now there's the individual and then the personal, because what happens in Christianity is, that's right, we have the image of God in us, in the individual, but we then are part of becoming in Christ, and we're part of a body, and you're a member. And so this part here, I think, is critical. And I think one of my critiques of Peterson is overemphasis on the individual, because, and this is where he's in danger of a degree of ideological possession about the individual, of falling into individualism, because in terms of Christianity, you have the individual and you have the body. You have the individual and you have the member, and because the individual is a member, and so that then is reinforced in the New Testament. And because again, Peterson doesn't participate in a body, meaning a church, and you're going to tend to fall prey to individualism.
But curiously, Peterson himself falls some way short of being Christian, right? He's not, there's a sort of ambiguity there. My colleague Ian Christie put it beautifully when he said that Peterson is sort of suspended between Christ and Nietzsche.
That's brilliant too. When I listened to this, he said suspended between Christ and Nietzsche. I thought, yeah.
Because Peterson is sort of suspended between Christ and Nietzsche, because like Nietzsche, he wants away from the herd morality. He wants people to find their own way, forge their own path. But he won't go all the way to the nihilism. He won't go into this kind of, and therefore we make everything up. There is no fundamental meaning or whatever. But he's not, with Christ, he's kind of like, yes, Logos incarnate, but he's not willing to go to charity and community and communion, which is where that leads. So he's sort of in this awkward place between them. But it's still, that place is quite an intriguing spectacle, for those who sort of know those intellectual traditions.
And this, now we get into, Peterson is a Western Canadian. And, some of the values, I grew up on the East Coast, I've lived in the Midwest, I've lived outside the United States, and now I'm on the West Coast of this United States, this Western rugged individualism. That's a part of Peterson too. And what is lacking is often, just as he says, the incorporation in the body, which is exactly, of course, where Pajot really leaned into him and says, part of why you're suffering is because you are not part of a body. You're not in submission to a body. You're not surrounded by a body, and you're sort of an individual sticking out in the world, vulnerable.
He's really struggling to land. So that's why one of the reasons he's so entrancing for people, because it's as if he's trying to land somewhere but can't, because he hasn't resolved those kind of tensions.
Yeah. So the interview with Peterson, I think, grabbed me at the time and still grabs me, sort of makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, was in the transliminal interview when he talked about, he was actually being asked whether he believed in God, and he kind of said, I don't know.
And that transliminal interview, those are some of the best ones he gave, and they were before all of this.
Answering that question, it puts me on one side of a binary, and I don't think people understand what they mean when they ask that question. But he said something like, if you get yourself together, then we don't know the limitations of that. We don't know the limitations of us if we really get ourselves together.
And that continues to be, I know a lot of people see migration in Peterson to Christianity, to the church, maybe, but I listened very carefully to his answers, and they're actually quite consistent. Now, whether something will change, I don't know. Maybe his wife's journey will change him, I don't know, but that's been his answer.
limitation, some one side of a binary, and I don't think people understand what they mean when they ask that question. But he said something like, if you get yourself together, then we don't know the limitations of that. We don't know the limitations of us if we really get ourselves together. And if we really get ourselves together, who knows what happens? Like, what transformations might be possible in the world? And he said, I've had intimations of that. I've had intimations of what that might mean. It's kind of interesting, like that whole trajectory that happened to him after that. Like, was that feeling of sort of synchronicity of a similar process to that? But I feel that I've had similar experiences, like that sense of, and I'm sure many people have, like this sense of when you get into a real state of flow, things start to work, synchronicities start to happen, you start to feel like there's more to life than the kind of materialist framework would make you think there is, and this sense of tapping into something greater. Like that for me is like the core of what Jordan Peterson was at least meant to me when I was, and I kind of forgive him an awful lot just for bringing that into the cultural conversation.
And I think when David says that's very revelatory of David and his project. And for me, that's when in the Peugeot-Peterson conversation where I wouldn't necessarily frame it quite this way, but very close, where they want to sort of have the objective and the narrative meet. And again, I would say heaven and earth, the physical and the I want to say spiritual, and it is the right word, but it's can. You see, and this is I think where David is at, and David has talked about. I mean, part of Peterson sort of made him wonder if Christianity could possibly once again for him be effective, and I don't know where David's at right now, but and then kind of later, no, this of course brings lots of thoughts to my mind.
So he did. The question is whether it's still there, right? So this is 3.5 years later. That's why I was excited too, right? I'd created this.
See, and I think this is what people are looking for. It's right there, because we want to know that there's a there. We want to know that there's a story that we're actually participating in. I mean, that's in many ways the answer to the meaning crisis. And this is where the Klavan interview gets interesting, because in some ways Peterson is just so close. When Peterson basically, this is why I want to do a commentary on that, and I'm debating in my mind if I'm going to stick with this all the way to the end, or if I've actually gotten enough of this to set up the Klavan interview. Because to one degree or not, if you're relating with, and I'll use Petersonian language here, if you're relating to being in an optimistic way, if you're leaning into it, that's very close to what Christians talk about with faith. Maybe I should leave this here and then go to the Klavan interview. Well, maybe let's let Jonathan Rowson finish what he's going to say. Maybe I'll get hooked on another train. We'll see.
New organization with Thomas Bjorkman, ostensibly about bringing spiritual and psychological matters to bear more profoundly on questions of socioeconomic and political matters. And so he...
See, and right there, okay, so to bring these matters to bear out in the public domain. And this is exactly the issue that, let's say, the American experiment, which was copied around the world, the separation of church and state, the creation of the secular, an agreed upon rule that at least here within this spectrum, within this small time frame, because remember, a cyclum is fundamentally a time frame more than a physical limitation. But within this cyclum, we are going to keep within these rules in the public way. But yet our hearts lean into, but is there really more of a story out there?
Comes along and people are paying a lot of attention. We think, great, like this is it. Someone else is seeing it, and people are responding. Okay, maybe this is happening. But what he was saying was quite particular, right? I mean, yes, there are moments like particular answers he gives in particular places that are luminous and helpful. And for what it's worth, I was never really an atheist. I mean, not clear what I am, but it seemed pretty obvious to me that the question was what the nature of God was rather than whether there was something there. And I still haven't really figured that out. But I know that with Peterson, it sounded a lot like he was speaking of a sort of monotheistic God. And in the conversation he had with Ian McGilchrist, they have this toing and froing about being and becoming. And I think for McGilchrist, God is more of a becoming, and for Peterson,
process theology. And, McGilchrist's first conversation with Peterson, and when I get into McGilchrist, it's a lot of what he goes into is very similar to process theology.
It's more toing and froing about being and becoming. And I think for McGilchrist, God is more of a becoming, and for Peterson, it's more of a being. But then he doesn't really want to say he believes in God for the reasons you mentioned. So yeah.
I mentioned a little bit earlier on that sort of we can afford guidelines if you're middle class, but if you're in jail or have a drug habit or have a gang problem, you need rules. And I think part of this is also true with respect to God. Well, if there's enough if there's enough herd immunity, I had this conversation with Ryan Bennett. If there's enough herd immunity in the culture so that you can sort of maintain a humanism, which, as I think Glenn Scrivener and Tom Holland talked about, is sort of Christianity light, well, then you kind of can keep God at arm's length. But if you're on the grime line, if you're in jail, if you have a drug problem, when the slats are kicked out from under your life, well, then you tend to need rules. And then you want a crunchy God and a real religion. And, there's a way in which a certain amount of keeping gods at arm's length is a function of religious affluence, let's call it.
Yeah, I don't know. I think bringing that into the conversation is a good point. Like, did that happen? In what way did it happen? Because that was what excited me too. It was like, look, people, stop talking about marginal tax rates. Stop talking about GDP. Stop banging on about the slight tweak in education policy and the latest figures of which country is getting better maths results than the other. Let's speak about the meaning and purpose of life, right? Here's a guy who's doing it, and people seem to love it. There's an appetite for this, an audience. Go and look. That's what was driving me to say to people, Peterson has something to say. And at that level, I'm totally with him. Raising the tenor, raising the mattering, the sense of significance, that life is precious and you need to focus on what it means for you and for everyone else. He did that brilliantly. It's just a question of once you get into the details then of what it means for men and women and what it means for getting a job, and then it gets a bit more murky, and he's not such a great guide maybe.
See, and this dynamic, this is part of the reason I do these videos, because I've watched this video once and I had a lot of thoughts about it, but they're often just a little vague. And even if I'm just sort of monologuing in my own head while I'm watching a video, it's just, you can be sloppier in your own head. It's sort of like learning the violin. I can hear myself play something in my head, but when I have to do it with my fingers and an actual instrument, it's a whole lot worse. And I realized just how low resolution my mental image was as compared to what I can actually pull off in my life. And that's an analogy for a lot of life. But, at this point here where, both of these guys who are, they're to my knowledge, not practicing Christians. They're not going to take really hardline stands about too much. A lot of the advice, and again, I look at myself. and the weaknesses of my own ministry and the limitations of my own ministry. And once you lay down a hard line and a rule, there's going to be, let's be fair to those of us with college degrees and middle class incomes and a lot of order that we grew up with and have benefited from. There's a problem with those rules often, and they don't always go everywhere, and sometimes they need to be broken, and there needs to be exceptions, but there's a lot of people who need them and benefit from them and work them, and if they don't have them, they have nothing. And for those of us who can sort of live with guidelines, I think if you watched us carefully, you'd recognize, there are some rules underneath those guidelines too. We just sort of hedge the Torah and don't cross them, whereas many others are and do.
But I agree with you that I'm grateful that those questions were raised. I'm just not sure how much they've stayed with us.
Or how much they've progressed.
And I agree 100% with this point. And I think this was, again, a weakness of the Peterson moment and why the Stoa has all these people in little Zoom squares and Rebel Wisdom has all these people in little Zoom squares. And I work with a Discord server because we're making up for what Peterson lacked in his first wave.
Progress, but when people who are not that interested in Peterson, who've maybe, I don't know how many hours you've spent, probably more than me, but those who haven't spent more than, say, 20 hours reading or thinking about Peterson, and I could probably add a 0 to that, and you could probably add 2, but those people, they've got some take on him. The take was something to do with maybe young men, something to do with the way he spoke, something to do with women, the Cathy Newman. There's a few little bits.
Very low resolution, and again, there's nothing wrong with low resolution. It's low resolution because that's all they have time for. That's all they've given time to it.
Pieces, but I'm not sure they've brought this, we should talk about the Logos. I don't think that's really come through. And the way I end my paper, where I really try and, look for the good in what he's offering and what was overlooked by people who were criticizing him, as you know. But I do end up in this position of disappointment, actually. And the disappointment was something like, you have the audience, you have the intellect, you have the curiosity, you seem to have the goodwill even for a more viable civilization. And you have the capacity to understand opposing points of view.
You were a father, but you didn't build a house.
But you don't seem to be that interested in finding that larger, wholer truth. Instead, there's a kind of doubling down on this way rather than that way. That saddened me a bit. I think there was a chance there. But on the other hand, expecting too much of one person, right? Because the human side of this is just a guy, like any other guy, like you or me or anyone else, thrown into the world. There is a kind of Christian, backdrop to it, because there was a kind of sacrifice. And then there is maybe a kind of resurrection going on as well.
But there wasn't a church. I want to play this clip from my far too neglected Vanderclips channel.
Start maybe with Tara's point about sort of the durability of this kind of, I'll conflate your 2 points and say the durability of imminent individualist religion in American life, right? And the fact that you have plenty of, divination and God within spirituality going back to the 18th century.
So again, this is a conversation between Ross Douthat and Tara, who wrote Gods. And I can't think of the name right now. This is the problem when I don't do a PowerPoint. I go all over, and then Tara Isabel Burton? I think so. And Stephen Smith, this guy who wrote this book. And so you got Rebel Wisdom, and okay, we need the mythos, and we need the spooky stuff, and we need the meaning, and we need all of that. And of course, the 19th century had all of that.
It seems to me that if you look at sort of the historical pattern in American life, you have sort of either surges of that kind of spirituality or particular religious geniuses who manifest it. And then the movements and institutions that they build have historically then been sort of pulled back towards a kind of normative Christian structure or framework, to use Steve's account, right? So, to take the examples of the two biggest 19th century examples maybe are Christian Science, which comes out of New Thought in certain ways, and Mormonism, which gets its start in the sort of the kind of divination happy world of upstate New York in the early 19th century. And both of those, if you look at them from a sort of, how Christian are they perspective at the outset, you can make a case that they're both pretty stark departures, maybe not getting all the way to something we call paganism or post-Christianity, but clearly really stark departures. In Mormonism's case, you mentioned polyamory, right, as a feature of the contemporary political landscape. Early Mormonism goes all the way to polygamy. And then, over the course of the next
Strange Rites is her book. It always bubbles up.
100 years, you get to a point where by the time of the 1950s and 1960s, both Christian Science and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, while they're still regarded as heretical or dangerous or cultic by some other Christian denominations, are, I think, reasonably seen as connected to a kind of, a kind of Christian tradition in American life. And there's clearly an aspiration, at least among parts of the leadership of those what become those churches, to move in that direction. And it seems to me one thing that's been different since the 60s and 70s, right, is that hasn't happened to the same degree, right? So we've gone through the sort of Marianne Williamson presidential campaign, which unfortunately has not won enough support to merit the fascination that I've applied to it. But I feel like a 19th century version of Marianne Williamson would have started a church, right? And would have, and over the course of 50 years, there would be a sort of Williamsonian denomination that had some sort of ambiguous relationship to the Protestant center in American life. And, Williamson has some kind of institution now, but it's very clear that she doesn't regard herself as in that light. And the same goes for, figures ranging from Deepak Chopra to Oprah Winfrey and so on. And so I'm curious what you think, spending time in these religious worlds, what happens when that doesn't happen, right? Like, what happens to this kind of spiritual energy if there isn't one, institution building, or two, a sort of pull back towards a kind of, quasi-normative Christian framework? Does it just continue? Are we in just a sort of endless cycle, right, where astrology was big when my parents were young, and when I was growing up, I knew what my parents' sign was, and then by the time I got to college in the 1990s, nobody talked about astrology anymore, but now it's back. Like, do we just run a cycle, or what do you think happens?
So I think I would motion that, you mentioned Oprah, and I can think of Gwyneth Paltrow, that the lifestyle brand may have perhaps in some senses replaced the church as the kind of institutionalization of a certain kind of spiritual trend, which is to say, sure, Oprah doesn't have a church exactly, but at the same time, there is a degree in which sort of with enough money, with enough of a following, the sort of grassroots fringe traditions do become, like astrology, like psychics, which are now at Goop Summits, do become codified in some way.
Psychics at Goop Summits. And so again, no institution building. And I think Rebel Wisdom is sort of, but I think the weakness of this commercial approach, as Tara Isabel Burton made the point, this commercial institution approach is, to me, it's so much less than, and so many of the churches right now are so much less than the rules, the hard lines, the bright lines that my great-grandparents' generation, when they came to America, and they had far fewer resources than many of us do today, and they poured them into communal institutions. in the Christian Reformed Church. They poured them into the putting up Christian Reformed churches, building Christian schools, building Christian retirement homes, building those institutions, sacrificing. And so they left a legacy, and well, we might leave some videos.
But obviously, it sounds ridiculous to say that because, of course, he's just a guy.
Yeah,
So,
and this is the other question that comes up, which is, and I know this is felt very strongly by people who are fans of Peterson, is like, leave him alone, don't criticize him.
And this word fans, that so struck out in the Peugeot-Peterson conversation. And Peterson's, well, I've got fans. And Peugeot's like, dude, fans are dangerous. They are. Fans are dangerous. Yeah, they can, they'll buy your books, they'll listen to your videos, they'll show up at your events, they'll, support you on Patreon. Fans are dangerous. You don't really need fans. What if, one of the funny things is, of course, my wife is not my fan. If my wife was my fan, that would probably spell trouble for me. What I mean by that? Because I don't really need fans. I need friends. I also need authorities. Zach Stein, the video that was released by Rebel Wisdom after this one, I'm thinking about me doing some commentary on that, at least the first part of the video, because, when he talks about teacherly authority and answers a question about education, and he's telling this young man, you should consider homeschooling or unschooling. I'm just like, that was the fundamentalist answer 20 years ago. Fascinating.
And the question is, like, certainly I'm asking the question, like, how much did I have personally invested in him as a person? And is that entirely fair? Is that fair? And also the questions that we're asking, are we asking for us to learn the lessons and for all of us collectively to move on from what Jordan provided? And I think what Jordan provided was absolutely of...
And again, even for us to learn the lessons, okay, what does that mean? Maybe it's for us to build the institutions.
Huge importance and huge value. Is it right to think that he's the one who needs to kind of take this thinking on, or is it up to us to take it on?
Yeah, I mean, my response to that is... and
I mean us, not us.
Yeah, I know. The world as a whole.
Everybody.
No, but us too.
Yeah, but I think, so it's worth just pausing and think about what exactly we're talking about here, because it's not obvious to everyone. But as you painted it, the world in 2017, 2018, for many people there was this sense of sort of stasis and decay and a kind of failure to reckon with what was going on, an inability to deal with the most fundamental problems of our time, the kind of rise of surveillance capitalism on the one hand, with government not really playing an adequate role, failure to deal with the climate crisis maybe, increasing political polarization, a sense that things were slowly but surely falling apart, even if there was also a countervailing story that said things are better than ever, look at the data, life expectancy, economic growth, and so forth. But as Daniel Schmachtenberger puts it very elegantly, when one part of a complex system is apparently doing well and another is apparently doing very badly, it doesn't mean the truth is some kind of balance in between. It means an inherent instability. And that was the context in which it's like we need new narratives and new sense of who we are as human beings and a new sense of meaning and purpose in life. Now, I don't think Peterson himself actually brought that, by the way, because for those who know, like, I don't know, René Girard or William Irwin Thompson or James Hillman maybe, it wasn't radically new material. It was sort of Peterson's own take on a lot of things other people had said. What was different was the tenor. It was the mattering. It was the intensity of, guys, let's really live fully. Let's figure this out. And he did it in his own somewhat, perhaps limited, perhaps distorted, but nonetheless captivating way, in a way that was compelling and even inspiring. It's like, a lot of people were like, whatever that guy's on, it's interesting to watch because...
When Harry met Sally, I'll have what she's having.
he clearly is living at a high degree of intensity. But what you don't see on the cameras, of course, is the behind the scenes, the collapses, the fallout. So it's a difficult one to read. But the sense of disappointment, though, is not so much with Peterson for me. I mean, I know that there's a little bit of that. For me, it's more like the lack of curiosity about him amongst my peer group or my professional colleagues. It's like, aren't you a bit curious to know why millions of people seem to think he's so impressive? And they're not, and it bothers me. It's like, that's weird, you know?
Yeah. I mean, one of the other paradoxes that I would be interested to tease out, we haven't come to the developmental thing yet, but he was very critical of the new atheist worldview. And this is something that we've talked about, we've written about, like the deeper conception of what we are as human beings, and this limiting conception of sort of just the rationalist, just the materialist. But this is the paradox as well of the sort of partial truths, and I think he applied that to the individual really, really well. But what I like, the yes and is like, what does a society look like if you build it around a conception of a human being that is so limited? And the other paradox is that in some ways I think part of his sort of downfall with the benzodiazepines was a medical system that doesn't know how to treat, that overprescribes, for example, a medical system that has very little conception of like the vagaries of the human psyche, therefore treats everything with drugs. That like the corruption of the system under this kind of very narrow conception of people, but also it was the yes and, like he had a lot to say about the positives of Western culture, which is true, like hierarchies of competence, the amazing kind of thing that has been created around these values of Western culture. But at the same time, this sense many of us have of like, it's becoming increasingly hollowed out, being increasingly exploited by greed, it's being increasingly exploited by a very predatory form of, it's not capitalism, it's a certain cancer within capitalism that allows you to strip out all of the value from organizations. It's the fact that, as The Wire showed, like The Wire I think is the perfect kind of meditation on the death of America. Right. If you start measuring everything but valuing nothing, you get people meeting the stats, like the police force just busting people on street corners rather than doing actual police work.
That was if you don't know what The Wire is, you can find it on HBO Max. I watched it a couple of years ago and found it compelling. And
you get teachers that are being tested all the time, so they learn to meet the test rather than doing the actual education. Like all of this kind of hollowing out and corruption of a system, which I think is implicitly tied to a very narrow conception of what human beings are, an attempt to measure and quantify all of those things. And that was a yes and that for me was a huge paradox at the heart of Peterson's thinking, is that he talked about the value of Western culture I can understand that because it's being denigrated by a lot of the people that he's kind of in conflict with, like the kind of postmodern neo-Marxists, etc. But this was also a massive paradox within what became known as the intellectual dark web, because I think you had someone like Eric Weinstein and Brett Weinstein who were much more focused on the hollowing out of the system and the fact that, especially since the 70s, we've had increasingly hollowed out institutions. Ironically, some of the postmodern thinkers like Baudrillard talked about this, that you have institutions that become a simulation of themselves as they go on. And this, for me, was a huge paradox of that. It's like, yes, he was pointing at this, and in a way, I think if he was able to have done this kind of yes and with that would have then opened him out to people more of a left-wing sort of disposition who are more focused on the faults of the institutions, the faults of the... what do you think?
Benjamin Boyce and I talked about this a little bit about the left, because Benjamin highlighted it, and I don't know how much editing Benjamin will do to the video, but talked about there's a strange paradox in the left that on one hand they're deeply critical of institutions, yet their answers are almost always institutional. I noticed something in my own denominational structure that they're always restructuring as if it's the structure that will, if they get the structure right, then everything will come into place. And I really like that little speech that David just gave there, and he's right that there's a hollowing out and, a decadence. I think about Douthat's Decadent book, which I should really probably return to, reread, and retreat, because I thought that was actually quite an important book. And decadence is when you're someone I'll have to find it. I had tweeted, decadence is the affluenza avoidance of consumption, of consummation. And, I've often talked about Peterson's book tour as decadent. And then Aloysia W. Nelson, who I chat with quite a bit on Twitter, comes back with this quote: decadence means to be unable to reach the future in body or mind or soul. The only energy that can fight this evil is faith. Faith, properly speaking, never is a belief in things of the past, but in the future. And again, that gets at what Peterson is talking about in the Klavan conversation that I will do after this. I'm running out of time this afternoon, so I don't know how much more of this I can do. Human language is not complete without the democracy of universal participation by which an underlying speech through the ages is ascertained. Language survives any individual speaker. But that first thing, decadence means to be unable to reach the future in body or mind or soul. The only energy that can fight this evil is faith. And so decadence is all about moving towards consummation, moving towards telos, and your inability to do it.
Do you, like, that for me was just this central paradox in his thinking, because I think he was very easily painted as he's just an apologist for the current system.
Yeah, sure.
Whereas I think implicit in some of his philosophies was a more holistic view or a more complete view than that.
Quite possibly. I mean, it's hard to say, but there's a few things that came to mind there. One is just...
Well, before I let him talk some more, something will remain decadent until it takes on flesh, until it's incarnate, until it's instantiated. One of the long-term videos that's rolling around in the back of my head talks about kind of the process towards telos that things generally go towards and should go towards and want to go towards. I mean, it's almost like an Aristotelian vision of Aristotelian love moving the world. A satisfying conversation wants to lead to a relationship. At least between a man and a woman, that relationship wants to lead towards physical consummation of a union. That union wants to lead towards the production of a child. The production of the child wants to lead towards the parents filling that child with sacrificial agapic loves so that child has reciprocal broadening. That broadening leads to more children and a family, and the family leads to a society, and the society leads to the coming of a new heavens and a new earth. There's that flow in creation that things long for their completeness, and David Fuller is right here that the Peterson moment. I remember talking to Ron Dart about this, and Ron Dart, edited a couple of books on Peterson and was quite affirming of a lot of what Peterson had done, but it was also very early on quite warning and said, this could be a passing thing, and that's exactly right. And well, it's sort of now there's the Peterson second wave, and I think the conversations he's doing are not decadent. The conversation he's doing online are fruitful, and but Peterson's, depending on his health, I mean, he's only a year older than I am, and he could potentially have, his father and mother are still alive. My father's dead. That speaks well for his longevity. I don't know how that beef diet's going to go long term. We'll see. But so, he's made money. He's become famous. He's written popular books. what now? What's it going to take? I mean, he's got to be thinking about these things. And
at a human level, while he did shoot to fame and did very well, I believe there was then a lot of family, crisis and tragedy that, that compounded an existing mental health vulnerability. And, at a personal level, I wish him well. Like, having met the guy like any other human being, you don't want unnecessary suffering. And it has been good to see him convalesce in that sense. So that's just the first thing to say. The second is that where I began to appreciate Peterson again after going through that writing process was when his foreword to the Gulag Archipelago came out, the Solzhenitsyn classic text. And what I realized there that I think I already knew to some extent, is that Peterson's saying something that we maybe don't hear enough of, which is that civilization is a fragile achievement. Like, we're not that far from chaos and anarchy. And he feels that more intensely than most. We kind of take it for granted, stable governments, functional markets, schools to go to, healthcare available, shops to buy food from. It works, but as we saw with COVID, it's not that stable, right? It can collapse within a few days or weeks if a few things go wrong in a few different places, because it's so thoroughly interdependent, and we're ultimately biological organisms and we're all vulnerable. And we were moments during COVID where we maybe felt that pressure, like there are no riots on the streets, but who's to say there won't be if this lockdown carries on for another month or so. So to his credit, Peterson's message about, look, things could be so much worse. They really could be so much worse. And you've no idea how lucky you are, to put it in Peterson tenor. And I sort of think that's a valuable point not to lose sight of. And it's maybe one of Peterson's better and more important points. Just be grateful for the functional civilization and don't lightly mess with it, right? By all means improve it or try to, but don't sort of casually tinker with it because it's a profound and precious achievement. That's the first thing.
And I think that, earlier he talked about sort of Peterson's pessimistic, dark view, but so I'm glad he brought this point, because there's a lightness to Peterson, and this point is that lightness in many ways.
But yeah, coming back to the issue of yes and what could be done, I do think there's a little bit of a comedian-like quality with Peterson too. He responds to what he's part of. So I think...
And well, comedian in terms of the responding, but also, yeah.
The thinker in him, the reflective, the highly able thinker in him, put him in a room with other intelligent people talking about different aspects of the world's problems, and he'll be very receptive, I suspect. And you'll find in him, yes, he'll make more sophisticated judgments about society and the economy, but he was never really meant to be an expert on those things. It was just that he was propelled, the combination of life advice and psychological background, and then the culture war dimension, meant that people thought he had answers to everything. And maybe the single best insight of the last few months since his new book came out was in a review by Oliver Burkeman, where Oliver makes the really astute point that a lot of people don't understand something about Peterson, because the way Oliver puts it, there's two main kinds of suffering, right? There's sort of existential human suffering, which is suffering about the nature of being human. The fact that you get ill, the fact that you struggle for meaning, the fact that you will die, that you have relationships that are painful, that there's anguish. These are just inherent existential phenomena, and there's a lot of suffering in that, what Peterson would call the challenges of being, or bearing the burden of being, as he put it. And he's right about that, right? But that's more of a concern for people broadly on what's conventionally known as the political right, right? I don't like the political spectrum, it's not a conversation, but for what it's worth, those who refer to the right see those problems, and they think they're really important. Those on the left, as it's described.
Okay, and so again, the same point that I made before about those on the right. It's always so funny to me how the left undermines their own positions so reliably. Let's fill this world with immigrants from other countries who have had hard lives growing up. You think they're going to vote like you when they get here? No, because that point about existential suffering that the political right tends to see and focus on, it's because they lived in the world of guidelines and not rules. and they need rules, and they want rules. And so you sort of have, this, you're looking for authority, you're looking for a frame, and you need a frame. And of course, people who have implicit frames, so they can play with all the guidelines because there's already a frame underneath that's functioning, even if they don't see it and recognize it. And then, it's those kinds of people that go out into the wilderness thinking, oh, it's like, Pumbaa and the Lion King. Nah, you're going to get eaten by hyenas for sure.
Tend to be more interested in sort of problems of the current predicament. Whether you can get a job, how good your education is, whether you're paying enough for healthcare or not, and suffering arising from people who don't have opportunities. So if Peterson says, grow the hell up and...
And for the left, the managerial class, in their benevolence, trying to help other people, but and this again is something that you see all the time in the kinds of spaces that I've lived my life, where many in the managerial class have no idea of the actual lives of the people they're trying to help. And this is where Peterson's conversation with Theodore Dalrymple was really cool, because that's the grime line.
Sort yourself out, and you're saying, well, I've got to look after my sick mum, I'm living on minimum wage, I've just lost that job, how do you propose I do that? They're like, what about that? And Peterson wouldn't say that's not real. It's just that it's not really what he's talking about. What he's talking about is not the socioeconomic causes of suffering. He's speaking about the existential and psychological causes of suffering. And there's a lot of miscommunication based on a failure to see that. And a lot of the critiques of him are like, well...
And again, I think that's right. And I think that maps on what I was talking about in terms of the two audiences.
What about this stuff? And he's like, yeah, it's there, but it's not really my terrain. My terrain is bearing the burden of being, right? I think that's how he sees it. And that's why there's so much confusion around him. Because he's speaking of one form of suffering that some people think is the heart of the matter, and the others are not seeing him saying anything about the form of suffering that they see as the heart of the matter.
So we also interviewed Ken Wilber on Rebel Wisdom about Jordan Peterson, about the intellectual dark web, and I'd still direct people towards the Ken Wilber piece, Trump in a Post-Truth World, which I think gives... So that he uses the spiral dynamics map, and spiral dynamics is about kind of different value systems being online at the same time, and a lot of what we're seeing in the culture war is clashes between those different value systems. And why, I think this is incredibly useful for making sense of what's going on. I think is essential to make sense of both the Peterson phenomenon and the intellectual dark web phenomenon, and for me, where it went off the rails. Because if you look at what Wilber and Spiral Dynamics calls green is postmodernism. It's challenging dominant narratives and bringing in different perspectives, but when it goes off the rails, it becomes relativistic. It becomes the performative paradox of saying there is no truth, but that's a truth. And why I find that incredibly useful is that you can see that a lot of the pointing out the inherent contradictions and warped nature of green can be just done from a sort of reactive perspective, or what Spiral Dynamics does is it posits that there's a point beyond these value systems where you see that they're all necessary, that they all have partial truths that they confuse themselves with the whole truth. And that, I think, is an incredibly... then you can see what is a kind of purely reactive rejection and what is sort of saying, okay, we can see a partial truth here and we can see an integrated perspective beyond it. And that, for me, is like the central question. It's like, what of postmodernism is useful? What is not useful? Where does it go too far? What is the yes and perspective? And I mean, you know a lot more about kind of developmental theories, developmental thinkers than I do. How would you frame it within the context of making sense of the Peterson phenomenon?
Gosh, it's a big question. So we can play with spiral dynamics. I mean, I think from a sort of intellectual academic perspective, spiral dynamics is considered quite a crude tool, but in some ways it's a good gateway drug, if you like. It's a kind of, as long as you realize it's a map of something with lots of assumptions baked into it that may not be entirely valid. Well, it's certainly true that Peterson was responding and reacting to what you call green. And by that, it's not so much postmodernism as a whole, but a certain wave of postmodernism. Some have called it a third wave of postmodernism, which is identitarian in nature. And it takes sort of perspective or standpoint theory to a sort of absolutist extent, such that you can only speak to an issue with authority if you embody that yourself. So a white person shouldn't speak about the challenge of being a black person, for example, which of course is not the whole, may have something in it, but it's not the whole truth, and it shouldn't be that strongly expressed. And that writ large is everything from feeling that everything is seen through that lens of cultural war, in which it's all about what your identity is, what your race is, what your gender is, what your age is, whether or not you're able-bodied, what your sexuality is, and so forth. That those are the primary features of reality, and that we have to see everything through that prism. That's only one strain of one aspect of postmodernism, to be clear. But when Peterson spoke of postmodernism, he was very often speaking of that, and he was linking it almost at the same time to a particular view of Marxism, what he called cultural Marxism, which was a kind of collective gone mad, in which the individual giving way to the collective will was always and every time a disaster leading to the gulag, right? It was totally overplayed. But the way Peterson saw it, I think, is there's an inbuilt dynamic that once you surrender certain individual rights to the collective has a kind of will of its own and an underlying logic of its own that takes over oppressively. So when he would say things that were a little bit absurd, like equity, liberty, and whichever third...
Equity, equality, and diversity.
That's right, sorry, yes. Equity, equality, and diversity. Are we sure about that? I'm not sure.
Well, it's diversity, equity, diversity, inclusion, and equity. It's DIE.
Okay, I think it was probably those three, yeah. But I remember at one point he attacked these three things as being somehow evil, and that they inherently led to this mob rule collective in which the individual was squashed. And that was never really the case. Like, that's something to do with Peterson's own psychodrama. It's not built into postmodernism, it's not a developmental phenomenon. What is true is that there's a shadow to this kind of what's sometimes called green worldview. And the shadow is a sort of inability to properly grapple with power, an inability to see your own framing of the world as somehow constructed and limited, an inability to appreciate the validity of prior worldviews. So that's why a lot of people who have something like a green cultural code struggle to appreciate maybe the conservative philosophical tradition, for example, or they'll struggle to appreciate the stockbroker who really wants to make a success and make a lot of money. They'll just typically see that as an entirely bad thing. Now, these are broad brush generalizations, but insofar as that's the kind of framework, there are a few other things to add in here. The other is that there are so many developmental models, right? The spiral dynamics that you've mentioned is principally about cultural code. It's about the sort of organizing cultural dynamic of groups of people that individuals have to some extent. But once you get into the theory, how it's held by the individual and how it manifests as the group are quite distinct things. You can't really map them onto each other. What does it mean in the context of Peterson? I feel the more interesting thing about Peterson is to figure out the way in which he was captured by his own developmental limitation. Now, it feels audacious for me to say that. Like, I have my own limitations. Of course, we all do. I can't see what I can't see about how I'm viewing the world. What I felt with Peterson is that he was actually hiding in plain sight, because he kept speaking about ideology and the problem of ideology, and how his genesis as a thinker was how on earth could the world destroy itself through the Cold War based on ideology. That's what got him thinking about maps of meaning and archetypes and so forth. He grew up in the Cold War as we did.
And the irony that ideology is a crippled religion. Where does Peterson stand with respect to religion? Does he open himself up to becoming ideological with his own little brand of ideology and if he gets a sufficient number of fans, because to a certain degree you need a critical mass in order to develop the weather, in order to develop the arena in which you can inhabit and then function, to be the agent within that arena, and in fact to wield the arena. This is a fair point.
But ideology is precise. He was ideological. He is ideological because this view of the world that he has, which is a sort of fairly fundamentalist, individualist view, that the individual is sacred, the collective is a threat, and that we have to organize society in such a way that we keep the collective at bay and honor the individual, is too extreme a view. In fact, what we need today, I think, developmentally at a cultural level and an individual level, is something about the co-constitution of the individual and the collective, in which the individual doesn't arrive. There is no such thing really as the individual. I mean, you can take a Buddhist view on that or any kind of process philosophy view. The individual is totally constructed by its surrounds and its history and its genetics and a million other factors.
Totally?
Well, good point. Not totally.
And I didn't remember what all the points were in this video. I should probably take notes first time I watch them through, but I'm usually driving or doing dishes or doing something with my hands when I'm listening to these videos. But I'm so glad that, because right there when David catches him, then totally, because okay, well that's excellent.
That's where I would
significantly, let's say, and its history and its genetics and a million other factors.
Totally?
Well, good point. Not totally.
That's where I would
significantly, let's say, significantly. But what you get to though is a position where a lot of the things we say about the individual being sacred remain true. The construction of the individual through all of these biopsychosocial processes, it doesn't make the individual less real or fundamental or sacred even. But it's just important to see that those things are there. So what you want in the end is not individual.
And the irony of when I look at where many people in our society, I mean, the secret sacred self is sort of the trap door by which people imagine their autonomy and their agency, whereas, and that comes somewhere from below, but it's still outside. But of course, with Christianity, that comes from above and is a gift. It is built into us by design, and that's part of the reason we relate above and we mirror above and we're drawn above, and heaven and earth have to somehow meet.
Individual or collective. It's not the Manichaean binary. It's something more like collective individuation. It's like, yes, become who you are. Yes, find your own individual way in life. And there is something sacred about that.
And again, back to the individual member thing. In Christianity, the individual, Jesus and Christianity put the individual on the map, but embedded in Christ, in the body, as a member. So there's the individual, but the individual is also partly there with purpose. The eye has a purpose, the Apostle Paul in the book of Corinthians. The eye has a purpose, the ear has a purpose. So the membership and all of this purpose comes as a function of being part of the body.
But do it in the context of the collective that defines you and that you're responding to and serving, right? And you never really heard that from Peterson, this notion of service or charity.
Well, it wasn't a big emphasis, but it certainly was there because, become the person that can, take charge at your parents' funeral, become the person upon which, Peterson in that sense was quite evangelical in that society is sort of built up of all of these individuals. So again, I think it's a fair critique. Well, it's maybe, again, it's one of these critiques of, well, in my opinion, he should have emphasized yada, yada, yada. These kinds of critiques, however, are always a little... Peterson has achieved something that I certainly haven't, that, David hasn't, that Jonathan Rowson hasn't, to my knowledge. I don't know what he's achieved or not achieved. And so, it's sort of like the guy who bats 250... my baseball metaphor is going to be old. The guy who bats 250 in the major leagues, giving tips to Rod Carew how to stand it. Of course, most of you don't even know who Rod Carew is. I'm doing like the rest is history, giving a much better batter tips on his stance. I'll say it that way.
It was more about getting on in life, and sometimes even the domination view of becoming top lobster, as people joked. It was less about finding a form, like Bildung that you've covered in some of your other programs. Learn to become what you have to be to give back to society as you find it in this historical moment.
And again, I think I heard Peterson many times make that point.
So whether that's climate crisis or dealing with AI coming downstream or whatever it may be for you, grow in such a way that you can deal with that. So developmentally for me, there was something interesting about the cultural response, about those who couldn't see the partial validity of some of the things he was saying. And Peterson himself may be overreacting to one version of it, seeing a greater threat than was really there. But there's also an issue of how he constructed his whole worldview, having its own kind of development.
I don't know that he saw a greater threat than was really there. I think it's a legitimate threat.
Mental limitations. And then that's seen through my developmental limitations, but that's the way it goes.
Yeah, I think there's a paradox. There's something very paradoxical about that dynamic between the individual and the collective. Because I've heard that argument, I think, about individuals. I think it's common within sort of metamodern thinking that the individual is kind of an illusion because I think that's wrong. I think it's obviously true that the individual is contingent to some degree on kind of our relationships, our upbringings, all that stuff. But the paradox for me is resolved. Like, we have to go through the the individuation process, like the kind of the Jungian process of doing our own work. And I think part of the paradox is that I think a lot of people try and jump to the collective before they've done the work. Right. And this comes from a very...
And this gets back to the major bickering point between Rowson and Peterson in the interview. And I think David's speaking to it well, that in a properly ordered society, the individual demonstrates their competence during and as the group votes them up the hierarchy and gives them increasing amounts of responsibility for the group.
Very, very instinctive place of having done various forms of personal growth work, of spiritual practice, and there is a felt sense for me of when you tap into that place that is kind of almost beyond the individual, like this sort of timeless, transcendental aspect, maybe, yeah. That feels like, and then if you do that work with others who are also doing that work, you get a felt sense of meeting the same person. Right. In some ways, like, you recognize yourself in the other in a very felt sense way, in a very kind of like in a way beyond the individual.
It's very churchy.
There is a feeling of a collective consciousness or a collective experience of meeting oneself again, but you can't.
And in fact, church has all sorts of far more concrete labels and language that it uses instead of a lot of this language, which sort of feels a little theoretical.
Bypass the work of real accountability, of real truth speaking, of real shadow work, of real kind of deep inner inquiry.
And you could take almost all of those terms, and shadow work, well, that's confession and mortification. Accountability, well, that's discipleship and discipline. I listen to this and I just think we've opted for words that are new. There's nothing wrong with that. We've opted for words that are more theoretical and less concrete. Discipleship goes to a question of disciple. Mortification, it's death. Something needs to die in me. Confession is the shadow stuff. I'm by no means an expert in Jung. When they use this word shadow in these conversations, it's sometimes evil. Peterson uses it as a chaotic potential that should be integrated into the fuller person. And, that in Christianity, there are aspects of that. For example, the sex drive should be integrated and should be employed to pursue this kind of telotic pursuit of an end of consummation that yields children and family and society and the marriage of heaven and earth.
Before you get to that place.
Right.
That
So
for me is like the paradox of where it's resolved.
I think it's more or less, I agree. I mean, there's a lovely folk line about that, which is you have to be somebody before you can be nobody. And of course, people think being nobody is always entirely a bad thing, but in certain spiritual traditions, it's precisely to get beyond the illusion of the self. But equally, those people who achieve becoming nobody, as it were, certain advanced Buddhist practitioners, they have radiant personalities too. You know, they don't disappear into the ether or blend in the collective. They're actually individuated, and
I want to be careful about all these parallels, but of course in Christianity, the person who mortifies themselves and becomes Christ and is in Christ, dies to self and lives to Christ. There's a parallelism to a degree there, but in Christianity, the individual isn't an illusion, and the person isn't an illusion. There's more of a durable reality to that person, but that person then becomes a member of the body.
You long to be in their presence for that reason, because they are an individual, they've become somebody, but there's a sense in which they've seen through it as well. So it's both of these things at once. And one thing to add there is that this is quite a fundamental background tension in a lot of the discussions about the spiritual in general, because there's, and Zach Stein speaks to this better than I can, but there's a kind of quality of soul work that's really about something about your unique role in the world, finding the unique self that you're meant to be and are and can become in response to your historical challenges. But there's also this kind of transcendent quality of seeing through the self, seeing beyond the self, realizing that it's kind of an illusion. And you don't have to choose. It's not as though it's either one or the other. They're sort of part of the same, what Zach would call metapsychology, but they're sort of a view of what the human's going through that don't contradict each other. They don't cancel each other out, but they're just different kinds of work. And one is kind of about being somebody, and the other is about being nobody in a good way. And you can be both. I think so.
And that for me is the paradox of the kind of, the Buddhists talk about the sort of waking up to your true nature and that sort of timeless thing, that timeless essence within you. But I think there's a kind of Western form of that, which I actually ironically talked to Peterson about when I saw him in Toronto, and he talked about Jung's idea of the four-dimensional self. And what I understood from that was the four-dimensional self is that your potentiality is calling to you through your interests. And I've always felt like I've had these moments of kind of like awakening of like, not only do I have a sense of kind of that inner spirit, but also, or that inner essence, but I also have a sense of like everything that I've done up to this point has given me exactly the tools and exactly the experiences to do what I need to do next, which is
one might imagine Christianity, we'd call an idea like that providence.
It's an awe-inspiring feeling to have. It's like even that thing that I did that made no sense at the time has given me this tool now, which is what I feel is like my particular burden to carry, my responsibility to take on. And
cross to bear.
Yeah, we talked about this, and he talked about, that's Jung's idea of the four-dimensional self. And that's kind of a paradox. It's kind of a Western form of awakening that I don't hear many people talking about.
Well, there are sources, and I'm slightly on the edge of my competence here, but I can say that when I was coming to the end of The Moves That Matter, my book about what chess taught me about life, and I was trying to get to some kind of spiritual endpoint, a bit like this. And initially it was something to do with seeing through the self and seeing this personal story I'd gone through as somehow something that I'd transcended. But actually, then I began looking into some of this unique self theory, which is a bit more sort of Judeo-Christian, particularly Jewish, or even Kabbalah kind of theory. And that its sort of purpose of life is to find out who you are as an individual, as a unique, precious being, is also valid, right? And so I was sort of grappling, because they both seem true to me. And Perspectiva's title, Systems, Souls, and Society, we are sort of premise. There is a premise of the soul, that the soul is something real and valid and worth investing in. But there's also the spirit, which is something maybe a little different. And there I would just refer viewers to Zach Stein's work, because he knows it better than I do.
It's wonderful to see that he's back, that he's well enough to be engaging in conversations again. And what I would personally love to see would be, because I feel like we look back at that sort of initial trajectory, and I think partly it was because of the nature of the confrontational media coverage, but also I think something temperamental in him that made many of his conversations into a kind of mano a mano, kind of individualist, kind of maybe slightly kind of top lobster
It was a battle
interaction. Could there be now more of a sort of dialogue, more of a kind of emergent, it's more of a dialogue, more of a...
So I'm not sure. So there was a moment, as I mentioned in that interview with him, where I spoke about his lack of sociological imagination. And I thought to myself for a while, what if Peterson, after this first book tour, were to spend, because he reads text so intensely and got in such great depth with all of the psychology he's done, what if he was to spend 2 years at some university institute studying sociology or economics or...
He tried to spend time at Cambridge studying theology, and they wouldn't let him.
Or anthropology or social sciences, away from just the psyche, and then come back and tell us about how this broader integrative pattern was there. I would have been intrigued to see that, but then, to be honest, I don't think it could have happened. I don't know if, even before the illness and the reaction and everything that happened to him, I'm not sure he wanted to do that. I don't know what his epistemic appetite. It's deep, but I don't think it's very broad.
See, and I think again here, the center of Peterson's mission, he's a clinical psychologist. He wants to save individuals from the meaning crisis. That's what he's done. And that's what he's been doing. And that's when he breaks down. And so as a community builder, I don't know that we're going to get that from him. And so I think that leaves something for me and for David Fuller and for others to say, Peterson's not going to build your community for you. What do you need to do? But at the same time, the point that they're making here, I think, is important, because Peterson clearly is gaining in strength. His health seems to be recovering. Where's he going to go? What's he going to do? Is he going to go back to the university? Is he going to found a new style of university? What's he going to build? And he's got time in his life to build. And he has a capacity, he has business interest and business capacity. So I don't know. We'll see.
And I think that's a problem. I think that means there's a limit to what he can tell us. He can certainly go deep into the psyche, and he can tell us interesting mythological stories and what they might mean. But you mentioned Wilber earlier, in Wilber's classic quadrant map of the different parts of reality, things about social structure and ecological systems, I don't know if he's ever going to say anything particularly profound about them, nor is he going to show that much attention to them. So a dialogue with him, I must admit, although at a personal level, yes, it's good to see someone recover, and I know also that millions of people literally really cared about him and really think that he helped them, and their lives would have been destroyed had it not been for encountering his work. So that's not minor. He really did help a lot of people. But speaking personally, in terms of my relationship to his work,
well, and again, to go all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, when David Fuller writes a piece that says, "Can this man save Western civilization?" that bears on this question here about systems, society.
After I'd written that piece, which took me almost 6 months to write, I noticed there wasn't that much appetite anymore to go back there. And his new book that's come out, I'm not saying I'll never read it, but I noticed that I'm not not reaching for it. I'm not that intrigued. I sort of felt as though I exhausted whatever that energy was that you mentioned. There was a feeling of coming out the other side of it, which is not to say that it won't be good or that others shouldn't read it. Just that it's interesting for me to notice that I feel as though I've done my time with Peterson. Curious to see what happens next, but probably not to be very involved in it.
And maybe one other thing to reflect on is the thing that I think a lot of people really connected with Jordan Peterson was the intense practicality of his work. I mean, it was incredibly intellectual, it kind of drew on myth, it drew on all these kind of different kind of...
And this is where you get the rules instead of 12 guidelines for life.
Evolutionary psychology or evolutionary biology, but essentially it boiled it down to something very, very practical. Clean your room, do something, which is like it's very rare for academics to break out in the way that he did, and and obviously a lot of people got a huge amount from that. Like, people genuinely feel like he saved their lives, that he gave them purpose. Are there any lessons there in terms of are you an academic, or you're certainly kind of involved in
academic in denial, or
you're a philosopher?
Yes,
you're a philosopher.
let's say, yeah.
What lessons are there for you? What lessons are there for anyone in that kind of like coming out of the ivory tower and having an impact on the world?
Well, there's lessons for good and bad, right? Because on the one hand, what exactly was it that people were responding to? Do people want to be told what to do? Is that part of it? And if so, is that...
There's certainly a lot of people who want to tell us what to do.
Problematic in some way, or is that something that we should offer? There's that joke about giving me a one-armed economist, because they always say on the one hand, on the other hand. And I think that what troubles people about academia is that what academics are trained to do is to problematize things and to show nuance, and you get on in your career by the degree to which you can finesse everything.
Again, back to guidelines versus rules.
And Peterson could do that in his own domain, although he was often very, more dogmatic and absolutist on things he maybe didn't understand so well. But people responded to the, I think, therefore you should do this. And in that case, clearly you should.
Because, this is going to be really hot what I'm going to say right now, so hang on. Because he spoke with authority. You read that in the Gospels, and you kind of, what do they mean by that? Well, that's what we saw in the first Jordan Peterson wave. He spoke with authority. And that's why there was the whoosh, and the whoosh and then the backlash, because he spoke with authority. Now, I'm not saying Peterson is Jesus, and I've made abundant many of the shortcomings I see in Peterson as compared to Jesus, but he spoke with authority, and people listened, and it was true enough that it made their lives better. And that's what rules can do. They're also limiting sometimes and limited, but that's what happened.
You should do this. Go and repair your relationships, tidy your room, buck up, don't give up, But this is kind of banal folk advice, right? And you might say, well, it's not that banal. Some people maybe haven't heard it. Maybe we take it for granted. Maybe there's a whole generation who actually, for whatever reason, hasn't really experienced that kind of direction and are craving it. And that's possible. And maybe Peterson met that need. Is there a broader lesson for those who are in the world of ideas and intellectuals or academics? I think it's more about how he spoke.
In other words, no. In other words, he didn't really come for the academics.
I think it's that he gave nuggets of advice. I think it's that they could feel the visceral caring and mattering. When they listened to Peterson, they felt their life was on the line, because Peterson speaks as if it is. So if there's a message...
and for a lot of people it is. And again, okay, back to the two-armed economist and academia.
About the beauty of powerful rhetoric and getting into that. Because most academics are worried about what other people will think. and they'll finesse everything so much so that you lose
Cowardice.
the train of thought. Not the best ones, of course, but if there's a lesson, it's like how you say things matters almost as much as what you say, if not more so, actually.
And as we've said a few times, you're interested in a lot of the same topics. You're interested in the meaning crisis. You're interested in a lot of the same issues that Jordan Peterson was bringing attention to, but maybe dealing with them, addressing them in a slightly different way. Perspectiva we mentioned. Be interested to hear, like, what have you got coming up? What has Perspectiva got coming up?
This is just the end of the interview, so we won't do the whole thing. But yeah, so this was helpful for me, and I hope it was helpful for you. So it's good to be back from vacation. I've been busy, so I don't know at what rate videos will come, but they'll come as they come.